Gilded Age in America was one of mystery, industry, and glamour. But underneath all of that there was dirt, grime, and corruption. Gotham City was no exception. Founded in 1685 as a settlement, Gotham quickly made a name for itself in the fur trade. It quickly grew until British occupation in the early 1700s, and then the Revolutionary War in 1776. There were many men and women of historical notoriety in the war, notably among them Mad Anthony Wayne. He had earned his nickname for his angry temperament, infamous for punishing the men serving under him severely, and also for his fierce assaults against the British military forces. Anthony Wayne was known for many acts, but not all of them were honorable. He is considered to be one of the people responsible for the start of a long history of aggression, violence, and discrimination towards the Native American populace. He amassed enough wealth and societal standing to pass down through his family. Long after his military career, some of his descendants set out and a few settled in Gotham City. The Wayne family in Gotham quickly used their popularity and accumulated wealth to found Wayne Industrial Co. on the cusp of the 1820s. Along with the Cobblepot and Sionis families, the Waynes helped launch Gotham in the American Industrial Revolution. This effectively put the families at the head of the economy in Gotham. Gotham began to thrive. As the 1830s arrived, so did the latest member of the Wayne family, Thomas. Thomas eventually met his wife, Martha Arkham, as he neared young adulthood, and the two became married. They were determined to put the sordid past of the Wayne family behind them and lead Wayne Industrial Co. in a different direction, one for the betterment and inclusion of the people. One step that Thomas took was hiring a young man, Lucius Fox, as his head chief foreman. It was a highly controversial move as Lucius was a black man, and tensions were high between northern and southern states. But Lucius overcame that obstacle, performing above and beyond for Wayne Industrial Co. Thomas and Lucius became fast friends. The future was looking bright. Then came the American Civil War in 1861. In April of 1861, Thomas and Martha conceived a child, unbeknownst to both of them. As the Civil War conflict began, Thomas left Gotham to fight for the northern states alongside his best friend, Jacob Packer. Utilizing their training as surgeons, they became field medics for the Union. Soon after, Martha began to notice the subtle changes. She was pregnant. In January of 1862, she gave birth to their son, Bruce Thomas Wayne. Thomas was, against all odds, allowed a brief amount of leave once he received word of his son's birth. It was a joyous occasion for both Thomas and Martha in the midst of such a bloody conflict, but left Thomas's friend Jacob a bit spiteful towards him. Though Thomas had to return to the war, the Waynes brought into their employ one Alfred Pennyworth, a young actor and former veteran from England. Thomas had met him at a boxing match some years prior where the two had gone head-to-head, concluding with a draw. Thomas wanted a butler to aid Martha in the raising of the young Wayne son. With the end of the American Civil War in 1865, Thomas returned home, disillusioned by the horrors he had seen in the battlefield. As the years progressed, he poured himself into his work as a surgeon. He pioneered new techniques, having seen many amputations and botched medical procedures on the battlefield. Thomas left the handling of the family company to more interested parties, while still remaining the owner. Bruce grew into a healthy young boy, cherishing his parents like none other. His parents loved him with all their hearts, and he loved them with all of his. When the boy reached the age of 10 years, one tragic event changed all of that. After attending a performance at the Gotham Opera, Thomas, Martha, and Bruce were riding home in their stagecoach. During their journey back to the Wayne estate, their coach was held up on one of the back roads. A man cloaked in shadow coerced them out of the carriage, demanding their valuables. Thomas, being a former military man, tried to stop the bandit, but was shot, soon followed by Martha. Bruce could only watch on in horror as his life crumbled before him. The criminal next turned his guns on the boy, but was stopped when a colony of bats was startled out of the surrounding trees. The shadowy man fled in terror, leaving the young boy with his dead parents.
Hungry? Order some subs to go at Firehouse Subs.
It was once the police became involved that a young Bruce met James Gordon, a rookie police officer new to Gotham. The young policeman and former Civil War veteran comforted Bruce and assured him in the midst of his shock and horror. This tragedy scarred the boy for life. He was left in the care of Alfred and a nun and family friend of the Waynes named Sister Leslie Tompkins. Bruce spent much of his childhood at the orphanage that Sister Leslie ran, St. Caldwell's. It became like a second home to him. He had few friends among the other orphans except for a young girl named Selina Kyle. As Bruce grew into young adulthood, he left the sanctuary of St. Caldwell's. He had grown accustomed to hiding his anger, masking his pain, and appearing composed, but underneath, he was enraged at his parents' murder. He saw the crime and corruption everywhere, the child labor in factories, the corrupt police force, the prostitution, and the petty crime that had become a part of Gotham's culture. He began to lose hope. One night, after a particularly intense depressive episode, he stumbled to his parents' grave. There, he vowed he would wage war on the crime and corruption seated in Gotham City. But in order to do this, he knew he needed to be more than just a rich aristocrat, more than just a man. In 1879, at the age of 17, Bruce left Gotham to travel worldwide, studying various methods of criminology, investigation, and deduction. Over the next few years, Bruce encountered many names that were mentioned in those circles. He met a young Harry Houdini and trained alongside him in the art of escapology, before the magician's illustrious career. He met Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and trained under him in the art of deduction, using the author's character Sherlock Holmes as an inspiration. He had many more teachers, with his final being Sigmund Freud, with whom he trained in psychology. The two left on rather tense terms as their ideologies tended to put them at odds. By 1889, Bruce had studied under and trained with some of the most accomplished men in history, but there was still something missing in his preparations. During his travels, he encountered many different cultures, and one symbol stood out to him: the bat. In Celtic folklore, they were a symbol of change, courage, and hope, while in most other places in Europe, they were symbols of evil, fear, and terror. Bruce saw this as a twofold reason for his war on crime. He would give Gotham citizens hope and courage while instilling fear and terror in the hearts of the criminal element. He would bring justice to a city in which there was none. And so, in 1889, the Bat was born. Bruce's return to Gotham in 1891 was a triumphant one. He spent a small amount of time visiting old friends: James Gordon, Sister Leslie, Lucius Fox, and most of all, Alfred. He also ran into his father's old friend, Uncle Jacob Packer. Soon after his return, a mysterious new figure appeared: the Batman. The filth and scum that had festered for so long in the streets of Gotham finally had a response to wash it away in the Bat. The Batman began his war on crime, filling the massive void caused by Gotham's underworld. Rumors began to circulate. Was he a vampire? Was he a spirit? Or was he just a man? But alongside the start of his crusade came another, one with much more sinister goals. Whitechapel, 1888 to 1891. This was a time of terror in England. It saw the murders of many women by the killer known as Jack the Ripper. He had left numerous notes and letters to the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, but none could guess his true identity. Then, as suddenly as the murders started, they stopped. No one knew who had committed them, and no one knew where he went. There were suspects, but evidence was never conclusive. What had happened to Jack the Ripper? It wasn't until 1892 when the world got its answer. The Gotham City Police Department began to receive letters from Jack. He openly challenged the police as well as the rumored Batman, stating that he had already begun killing again. The reign of the Ripper marked a new age in Gotham, as it was one of fear and of hope. Jack the Ripper and the Batman. Eventually, Jack the Ripper was apprehended, having been revealed to be none other than Jacob Packer, Thomas Wayne's longtime friend. His psychosis ran deep, and the man was sentenced to life in Arkham Asylum for the criminally insane. The Civil War had left its mark on the man. It was not long after that Gotham's city officials, wanting to put the horrors of Jack behind them, started to push for the Gotham World Fair. It was a renewal project that sought to bring in tourists from all around the world, showcase numerous industrial strides, and lighten the darkness that had surrounded Gotham for so long. It was almost as if Gotham itself took this as a challenge. The Gotham World Fair saw numerous threats from its conception. Edward Nashton and his labyrinthine hotel, Alexander Leroy and his magnifying lens used to burn buildings and people alive from his blimp, and the Wonder City calamity. The Batman fought long and hard to match the threats presented by these criminals. The evil in Gotham was beginning to evolve, but none were so gruesome as the Joker. Nicknamed the Merry Widower by the police, this man would marry women of wealth and status, then poison them using strychnine. He killed 10 women before being apprehended by police, but not before he attempted to evade them by suicide. The murderer used the very poison he had on his former wives, but it didn't kill him. It instead scarred him, turning his skin pale, his hair a sickly dark green, and pulling his facial muscles into a ghastly grin. The birth of the Joker was as gruesome as the horrors he would inflict on Gotham in the years to come. With the passage of years came a bitterness in Bruce's view of the city he had fought so hard to protect. He had seen the rise of many allies and many new foes, and what he was left with was death and destruction. He eventually retired in 1912, having reached his 50s. When the Great War arrived in 1914, he had seen too much battle in Gotham to have the physical capacity to join this battle. Instead, he used his influence and wealth to aid those disparaged by the war. Bruce came to Gotham's aid in many other ways, including training his eventual replacement, Terrence McGinnis. But he died in 1953 at the age of 89. Gotham still stands to this day, and it will always remember the Batman. Over the centuries, he has become the inspiration for many urban legends and folklore. To some, he was a mythical being. To others, he was a helping hand. But one thing we do know about him: he brought justice to Gotham. Selina Kyle was born to a mother who was a prostitute and a father whom she never knew. She was abandoned as an infant and left on the doorstep of St. Caldwell's, run by Sister Leslie Tompkins. There she was raised under strict supervision, but she would always watch the children who lived on the street. She envied them of their freedom to run about, going where they pleased and doing what they pleased. Eventually she began to sneak out of the orphanage at night, exploring the streets surrounding it. She would cover herself in dirt and tear her clothes to blend in with the other street urchins, keeping to the shadows. She maintained this habit until the day she left the orphanage years later. She also discovered the work and campaigns of Susan B. Anthony, becoming a budding suffragist. It was also while she was at St. Caldwell's that she met a young boy, Bruce Wayne. Bruce's parents had recently been murdered, the rich and mighty Waynes. Selina saw Bruce treated differently, and she initially resented him because of his recent loss. She had never known her parents, therefore never had the luxury of even knowing them enough to be sad. They weren't around, and that was that. Bruce also didn't live at the orphanage all the time. He had a butler to watch over him some days at the Wayne estate. In spite of her resentment towards the young Wayne, she began to see that he was unlike most of the preconceptions she had of the persnickety, arrogant upper class. He was keen to stand up to bullies and defend others. In spite of this altruism, she saw that he didn't have very many friends. The two began spending time together and realized they had something in common. They enjoyed adventure. Bruce had merely read about such adventures, while Selina had experienced many. She began to take him on her nightly escapades exploring Gotham. Eventually, years later, Bruce reached the age of 17 and decided to set out on his own. He said goodbye to Gotham, St. Caldwell's, and Selina. Selina was angry at him for leaving and angry at herself for being angry. She felt betrayed. Should she have expected any less from an aristocrat? She soon reached the age of 16 in 1880 and left the orphanage, setting out on her own. The young woman eventually came across Haley's Circus, a circus troupe that had traveled to Gotham. There, she met a lion tamer and was entranced by the use of the bullwhip, as well as the showmanship presented by the performers. She joined their band on its travels, seeing the world and eventually becoming a performer herself. She became a part of their dancing performance, learning the basics and becoming one of their best dancers. She also spent time training in the use of the bullwhip with the lion tamer and their troupe. She was going on a grand adventure, though eventually her heart called her home to Gotham in 1889. It was here that she found a job as a dancer at the Monarch Theater, showcasing her immense talent. It was also here that she saw injustice heaped upon her fellow performers. She saw one of the men in charge at the theater abuse his power again and again, groping the women who worked there. So, she tracked him down and broke his hands. The man left the theater and presumably Gotham, and was never seen again. This was a turning point for Selina. She had proved to herself that she was capable of taking matters into her own hands, and that she was a force to be reckoned with. When she returned to her job at Monarch Theater, she quickly became one of the shakers and movers in the business, finding her voice and taking care of her fellow women in the performance industry. She also became involved in a local chapter of suffragists, women who would meet to support one another and share like ideals. It was here that she met Mrs. Barbara Gordon, the wife to the inspector of Gotham's police. The two became fast friends, and Selina found a motherly presence in Mrs. Gordon, though they weren't that far in age. Selina found herself beginning to build her own life. She made a stand to challenge sexist ideologies present in the city council, and she fought to give the voiceless a voice. She had a true passion to help the impoverished in Gotham as well, whom the city tended to ignore so often. The young woman was quite surprised when she heard in 1891 that Bruce Wayne had returned to Gotham. Selina found herself feeling a familiar resentment at the young aristocrat's special treatment. He was praised by the Gotham Gazette as Gotham royalty in regards to his return. His status and gender allowed him to be handed everything on a silver platter. Soon after Bruce's return, the Batman appeared as well. Selina was suspicious almost immediately. The vigilante's presence started off as just rumors, and she tended to ignore those. But then the murders began in 1892. Some attributed them to the Bat. Others thought they resembled the Whitechapel murders perpetrated by Jack the Ripper. Selina didn't know what to think. All she knew was that impoverished women, showgirls, prostitutes, even societally average women, were being murdered, and the police seemed not to give a damn. Seeing the fear and awe inspired by the alleged Batman, Selina realized that it was something that could be utilized by her as well. She would become something more, and she would try to bring Jack the Ripper to justice in her own way.
I had ventured into Herr Tesla's workshop today. Admittedly, my expectations were quite low. I had expected a scattered collection of baubles and scrawled notes across any available surface, eccentricities to match his intellect. I was, however, mistaken. There I expected to find broken and half-finished projects. I found technological marvels, easily decades ahead of their time, such as the device upon which I am currently recording this account. I had told him such devices would revolutionize the scientific world, and he simply bequeathed this device to me. A generous act I will seek to repay in the future, perhaps with a similar innovation.
For much of the 1800s, psychology was a somewhat unexplored phenomenon. Dr. Hugo was one of a group of psychologists that trained and worked in Leipzig, Germany, under Wilhelm Wundt. Their goal was to develop methods in their field to better understand the human mind. Once Laboratory was founded in 1879. Hugo, in the pursuit of information that would aid them in the formulation of psychology, traveled to many locations learning about zoology and botany. In 1881, during his travels, he met one Dr. Pamela Isley, stationed in Gotham, one of the only women in the botany field at the time. It was here that he learned to act, then observe. Bringing back the methods he'd learned, he and the other psychologists began to conduct their own psychological experiments, acting, then observing with their control groups. During this time, Hugo Seltzum's experiments began to take a dark turn. He took his experiments a step further than just psychology. He had learned much about zoology and botany while traveling, and he tended to try experimenting on human subjects in areas of Mendelian inheritance, as well as human experiments inspired by those conducted on tailless mice by August Weismann in 1883. The horrors he conducted on these human subjects were shut down by Want almost immediately after their discovery. Dr. Seltzum left in disgrace. This led to him having much trouble finding work in Germany, so he traveled to America in search of work. He arrived in late 1885, changing his last name to its English translation, Strange, and so he became Hugo Strange, a psychologist with an exotic accent. He found his way back to Gotham, a city known for its corruption, knowing full well that opportunities would present themselves there. Strange was not disappointed and soon came on board at Arkham Asylum for the criminally insane, working directly under Amadeus Arkham, the founder and warden. Over the next few years, running the asylum took its toll on Amadeus, and he eventually lost his mind, becoming a patient within his own walls. Hugo Strange, being the foremost psychologist present there, took on the role of facilitator and warden at Arkham. Keeping a low profile, Strange began to use this opportunity to continue conducting his morbid experiments, completely unfettered and unsupervised. He fired anyone who became wise. Some of those employees also disappeared, speculated to have become subjects in his experiments. By 1890, Hugo Strange had gained a reputation in Gotham's high society, being the chief medical authority on the city council. Over time, Hugo became disillusioned with the petty politics of the council, as well as the day-to-day administration of the asylum. When Bruce Wayne returned in 1891, all of that changed. Hugo became secretly enamored with the young heir to the Wayne Empire. He recognized in the young man a fire that was lacking in so many people in Gotham. Strange began to study him, analyze him, observe. He approached Bruce many times intending to form a friendship, but the young Wayne seemed to see right through Strange's attempts to analyze him closer. Even more fascinating to Hugo Strange was the appearance of the Batman in Gotham, followed closely by the alleged reappearance of Jack the Ripper. Hugo surmised that there was a connection between the two, conducting his own investigations into the psychology of these two almost mythological figures. The more he learned, the more danger he was in, unbeknownst to him. His eyes may have been on the Bat, but the eyes of Jack the Ripper were on him all along. A lot was about to come to light about Hugo Strange, and his life would never be the same after that.
Today I have assumed the office of Amadeus Arkham, and with the funding and resources necessary to further my own research. How unfortunate that my ascent came at the cost of his sanity. But perhaps now these Untermensch will actually be put to use instead of wasting resources on perpetuating their existence.
Harvey Dent. Born to Richard and Lotta Dent, Harvey was a well-behaved child. His father was Gotham's county prosecutor and a part of Gotham's high society. The Dents had many connections, and one such friendship was that of the Wayne family. Thomas and Martha Wayne's son, Bruce, was around Harvey's age. The two became friends. One of Harvey's trademarks was his coin. He would flip it to make trivial decisions sometimes. Bruce always thought it humorous, and they would often make up games based around the flipping of Harvey's coin. Harvey kept that coin throughout his life. Although the Dents were upstanding citizens from the public's standpoint, Richard Dent was constantly plagued by the stress and paranoia that came with his job. He turned to the drink more often than not, often coming home in a drunken stupor. Sometimes his drinking would lead to beatings heaped upon Harvey. This impacted the boy deeply. Eventually, his father passed away from a heart attack. This happened soon after the death of the Waynes at the hand of a stagecoach bandit. Bruce and Harvey relied heavily on each other in their friendship. Their shared loss brought them together, but with one major difference. Bruce was enraged at the man who had killed his parents, while Harvey's rage was directed at his late father. As the years passed, Harvey's anger festered and turned him bitter inside. He accomplished much studying law and politics, eventually being groomed to take on the position of county prosecutor like his father. With Bruce's departure from Gotham in 1879, Harvey's bitterness took aim at his friend. The budding city official took Bruce's absence personally, though he would never admit it outright. Instead, he kept it bottled up, pushed down deep inside. Harvey eventually met Gilda Beaumont, a young lady in Gotham's socialite circle. The two began a courtship which led to their marriage in 1884. What was meant to be a joyful part of Harvey's life was tainted still by his bitterness and resentment boiling beneath the surface. Not even his acquisition of the position of county prosecutor truly brought him happiness. Gilda's marriage to Harvey Dent was an oppressive one. He was overly jealous, paranoid that she would leave him, and, like his father, eventually began to turn to the drink. He would be calm and composed some days, and others he would fly into a rage about something or other. Gilda was afraid to leave him as she felt that her presence was one of the few things helping the man whom she loved. This did not stop Harvey from being unfaithful to her, however. The young district attorney was known to frequent seedy clubs and even brothels on occasion, all the while keeping it a secret from Gilda. He led a double life in his marriage, as well as in his social standing. To Gotham's citizens, he was a paradigm of justice, but behind the scenes, many knew that he was merely another cog in Gotham's corruption. Whether or not he realized it, he had fallen into the same trap as his father. Harvey was on a one-way trip to self-destruction by the time of Bruce's reappearance in Gotham. Harvey still felt bitter towards his friend, but it was overshadowed by his joy and relief at seeing him. The two rekindled their friendship. Harvey's drinking receded, and his visits to risque establishments ceased altogether, though he still did not come clean to Gilda about it. Bruce could see that Harvey was struggling, although his friend would not breathe a word of it to him. All Bruce could do was be there for him and hope that that was enough. Bruce and Harvey would frequent the Hawkins Club, an establishment owned by Bruce, as well as the Monarch Theater. It was at Monarch Theater where Bruce first saw Selina Kyle after returning home, and Harvey first began to allow his resentment to poison his friendship with the young Thousandaire. Harvey was enamored with Miss Kyle, but she could see right through him, and would have nothing to do with a married man. As Miss Kyle began to spend more time with him and Bruce, Harvey began to notice that Bruce was taking a liking to her, and she to him. It went as far as Bruce sneaking her into the men-only Hawkins Club with them. Harvey found himself enraged at both Miss Kyle and Bruce. The county prosecutor allowed resentment to poison his heart, and began to fall into his old habits. Selina Kyle even once mentioned that he was a regular Jekyll and Hyde, to which Bruce agreed. He's almost a different person when he has the drink in him. Harvey's resentment grew as he saw Bruce seemingly get everything he wanted. A glorious return to high society, a veritable fortune of an inheritance, and the affections of Miss Kyle. He was a man spurned, and he continued to sink lower and lower. Soon Gotham began to see horrendous murders plague its streets. Some claimed it was Jack the Ripper returned, and others claimed it was the mysterious Batman who was rumored to roam the streets of Gotham. Harvey finally let his rage loose in this particular instance. It had been building and building for years, made worse by the fact that he had no one he felt he could confide in. He was bored with his lot in life, and as soon as he saw an opportunity to bring Bruce off of his pedestal, he took it. He was one of the main reasons that Bruce was tried and convicted for the murders of Jack the Ripper in Gotham. His two-faced nature was beginning to rear its ugly head.
Good evening, Mr. Henshaw. I'm Agent Drake with the Pinkerton Detective Agency. I'll be conducting your interview today.
So good to know the good commissioner is frittering away that mountain of tax dollars on outsourcing actual police work. Tell me, Agent, would you like to wait until after you've conducted your interview to beat the hell out of me? Or would you rather just get it out of the way?
I'm not like that.
Then you are a very atypical Pinkerton indeed.
I could be genuine. I could just want to help you.
You would be the first.
Most are quick to accept their preconceptions as fact, in the process ignoring those little bits of truth hiding just on the surface. For example, it is widely accepted that you killed your victims to claim portions of their wealth. Moving on to the next, like a common parasite.
Flatterer.
In the year 1890, Gotham saw a sinister string of murders. Most of the victims were wealthy middle-aged women, and all were found dead with no signs of struggle. Police were stumped, but one thing they knew for sure: these women had not died of natural causes. All of them were found having multiple muscles in their faces pulled back in risus sardonicus, otherwise known as rictus grins. This led the police to believe that the cause of death was poisoning by strychnine. After investigating and interviewing friends and family of the victims, police found a potential suspect: Jerome Henshaw, the illegitimate son of Emily Henshaw and a household manservant. The Henshaws were a less prominent wealthy family in Gotham, but the scandal of Jerome's birth was still the talk of the high society circles. Jerome was raised in the wealth of the Henshaw family, but due to his illegitimacy would not be privy to an inheritance. As the boy grew into adulthood, he became more and more resentful towards his mother and fathers, the one he knew and the one he didn't. He was by his birth a black sheep in the family, but he also resisted any kindness or love they had to show him, believing he was better than they were. Jerome had to believe this. It was a better alternative than listening to and believing all the taunts and jabs from his step-siblings. He learned to rely solely on himself. When he reached young adulthood, Jerome began to realize the limits of the wealth of the Henshaw family. He lived with his mother and step-family and only had limited access to the family trust. He tried to discover his biological father's identity from his mother, but all he could glean from her was that he had become a drunk and a criminal after fleeing the Henshaw estate. Eventually, she let slip that he lived on the outskirts of Skinner's End, a slum in Gotham City. Regardless of his own investigations, Jerome was never able to find his father. He only found reports of a petty criminal in a red hood who had been shot down by police in a botched robbery attempt. Because he was not an heir, Jerome found the need to accumulate wealth of his own. Growing up in high society, he knew of many older women who had lost their husbands to the Civil War or other traumas, and he quietly befriended them, carrying on multiple affairs and clandestine friendships. He charmed gifts of money and other valuables from them, preying on their pity for the poor bastard son of Emily Henshaw. When he had taken all he could from them without it becoming suspicious, they would be tragically found dead. Jerome had studied which poisons would be the most accessible and also most effective. and he settled on strychnine as his weapon of choice. It wasn't until the third victim that the police began to suspect someone was murdering these wealthy widows. They had incorrectly assumed that the first two deaths were suicide by poison, as suicide was falsely considered to be strictly a female malady in those days. After realizing their mistake, the police took action. Under the authority of Commissioner Tolliver, Inspector James Gordon was charged with finding the perpetrator of these grisly murders. James Gordon had previously fought in the Civil War alongside Thomas Wayne and Jacob Packer. When all of them had returned to Gotham, Jacob had left to go abroad and Thomas had delved into his medical practice. Gordon felt adrift because a part of him had never really left the battlefield. He enlisted in the Gotham police and quickly earned his reputation as a rigid idealist, flying in the face of corruption. The young police officer had met the love of his life, Barbara Keene, soon after. The two became engaged and married, giving birth to their daughter, Barbara Gordon, and their son, James Gordon Jr. Gordon proved to be as rigid a father as he was a police officer, though he was not unjust towards his children. Their family was quite progressive. His wife was close friends with Selina Kyle, the two having become acquainted at suffragist meetings. Eventually, after what seemed like an uphill battle at times, Gordon achieved the rank of inspector. Commissioner Tolliver was running for mayor of Gotham, and he wanted to deliver results in order to bolster his campaign. As a result, Gordon was also under a lot of pressure to catch the murderer. In Tolliver's mind, his reputation was everything, and this case would make or break his success in campaigning for mayor. Tolliver was rumored to be corrupt, occasionally taking bribes from dubious sources, so Inspector Gordon had very few resources at his disposal, as he was considered an idealist by his colleagues. Some claimed that Tolliver was out to get rid of Gordon. In spite of this, the inspector immediately got to work interviewing friends and family of the deceased women. Gordon soon found the common thread, a name, Jerome Henshaw. Jerome had been following the investigation in the papers and arrogantly assumed the police wouldn't be able to discover him as the murderer. When Inspector Gordon came knocking at his door, he allowed himself to be questioned, thinking he was still able to avoid discovery of his crimes. The questioning did not go as well as Jerome thought it would, and when Inspector Gordon left, he found himself panicking. Thinking with the irrationality of a frightened animal, he turned to the thing that had solved all his problems thus far, the strychnine he'd used on the widows. Instead of it killing him, it caused his facial muscles to spasm into a rictus grin, damaging his facial nerves. He laid on his bedroom floor near death until discovered by a housemaid. He was immediately rushed to the hospital where the police and Inspector Gordon were soon able to confirm Jerome guilty. Once he was physically able, he went to trial for the murders of the three widows. The Gotham Gazette dubbed him the Merry Widower, due to his ghastly appearance and the nature of the atrocities he had committed. Deemed clinically insane, he was sent to Arkham Asylum under the care of Dr. Hugo Strange. Strange was delighted to have such a celebrity of an inmate as Jerome, and even took his rehabilitation upon himself, conducting private sessions with the bastard son of Emily Henshaw. No one knows how or why, but it was here, facing the horrors of the asylum and the darkness within himself, that Jerome Henshaw died, and something much darker was born. Some attribute it to Strange's unconventional, even unethical methods, but whatever the case, Gotham would face many horrors at the hands of Jerome, or as he would better become known, the Joker.
They then missed the answers, having believed they found all they need to know. But they missed the way the corners of your mouth twitch upward when the grisly deaths of your victims are discussed, and the quickening of your breath. I believe you enjoyed killing them in such an agonizing fashion.
Well, I dare you to find any artisan that is not proud of his craft. And of course you are correct in that the average citizen is fast to believe in what they perceive as fact, missing all the little details. Even about you, Agent.
Oh? Is that right? Indulge me then. What has been dismissed about me?
Why, the scarring on your knuckles, of course. It's no secret that you Pinkertons are a pragmatic group. But most of you use a billy club when enforcing your specific brand of justice. It appears we all have our extracurricular activities, Agent.
It is better to be feared than loved, if you cannot be both. These words, written in Machiavelli's work, The Prince, took on living form in a young man, Jonathan Crane. His parents, Gerald and Clara Crane, had eloped from North Carolina and moved to outer Gotham. Clara came from a southern gentry family, but their eloping caused her to be cut off from them. They lived on some farmland just outside the city proper. Gerald, Clara, and their children farmed for a living. This was because of Gerald's background of farming with his family in North Carolina. Jonathan was a very attentive and analytical child. Education was important in his family, but Jonathan in particular took a liking to it. The children went to a small local school near the Crane farmstead. Jonathan could often be found sitting under a tree, reading anything he could get his hands on. He had two older siblings, Gerard and Helen, who never understood his obsession, and would often antagonize him for reading so much. Jonathan was a sensitive soul. One time in particular, after a quarrel with his siblings, Jonathan fled tearfully into the cornfield adjacent to the house. Not paying nearly enough attention, the boy found himself lost in the tall stalks of corn. He wandered for a bit, and then, by happenstance, came across a scarecrow. His father had recently put it up unbeknownst to the boy, and it terrified him. It was made patchily of sackcloth and hay, giving it a grotesque countenance. Hours after dusk, Gerald eventually found Jonathan cowering on the edge of the field, nearly hysterical with fear. He did not speak of what had happened out in the field, and none of his family pressed the matter. The young boy was never the same after that, and was filled with hatred for his siblings. As his education continued, Jonathan became fascinated with science. He took a special interest in the budding fields of agrochemistry, botany, and especially psychology. In 1885, he moved to Gotham City proper in order to attend Gotham University. Here he met Pamela Isley, one of the first women in the science field in Gotham. He learned alongside her about hallucinogenic plant life, which fascinated him. Crane's main focus was psychology, and he eventually graduated in 1889, top of his class. He soon found a job at Arkham Asylum for the criminally insane. He worked under Amadeus Arkham, the founder of the asylum and warden at the time. Dr. Crane's job was as a psychiatrist to the individuals incarcerated there. It was a good fit for him, although he felt constricted by the limited responsibilities he had been given. Crane wanted to perform his own psychological and agrochemical experiments. He was still haunted by his childhood fear of the Scarecrow in the cornfield, and he wanted to cure himself of that fear. Dr. Crane began to secretly conduct unethical experiments on the inmates. He utilized his knowledge of hallucinogens to try and isolate fear responses in his victims. Many who were entrusted to his care suffered permanent mental and emotional damage due to his experiments. Some of them became trapped within a nightmare of their own fears. As he continued to conduct these cruelties, Crane began to realize something. He enjoyed making others feel powerless, and he enjoyed being the cause of others' fear. He considered it a treatment for himself against his childhood trauma with the Scarecrow in the field. One of Crane's colleagues, Dr. Hugo Strange, took a liking to him. Strange shared with him the notes he'd taken working with Wilhelm Wundt in Leipzig, Germany. This bolstered the experiments that Dr. Crane was already doing. Crane used this new knowledge to create a drug that would induce fear in his victims. Strange also learned of Jonathan's experiments, but having conducted immoral experiments himself, did not report him. Instead, the two conspired to get Strange the position of warden and chief psychiatrist. They would accomplish this by driving Amadeus Arkham insane. Crane developed a new fear-inducing hallucinogenic drug that could be released into the air. He had done research on airborne chemical agents used by both Hannibal and some Native American tribes. This helped him to devise his own device for dispersing it. Crane also acquired designs made by Louis Hazlitt in 1849 for a breathing apparatus. He crafted his own to use in the preliminary tests of his airborne psychedelic. This way, he could be in the room with his victims as they experienced their worst fears. Amadeus was already grief-stricken by the recent murder of his wife and daughter. Once his family's murderer had been captured, Mad Dog Hawkins, Hugo Strange pushed to have Hawkins move to Arkham. Jonathan Crane then planned a series of meetings with Amadeus. The warden was unwittingly exposed to Crane's hallucinogen and his mind began to give way. Amadeus inevitably did go insane, taking Mad Dog to a secluded part of the asylum and killing him. Amadeus Arkham was locked away in his own institution, deemed insane. Together, Strange and Crane had accomplished their goals, and Dr. Strange became the new warden of Arkham Asylum. Hugo Strange allowed Dr. Crane to continue with his experiments, now completely unhindered by secrecy. As Crane worked, his obsession with fear grew and grew. He learned everything he could about fear. He was fascinated with the Greek gods of fear and terror, Phobos and Deimos. He modified his breathing apparatus into a fearsome mask after the description of Phobos in the Iliad. Staring backwards with eyes that glowed with fire, his mouth was full of teeth in a white row, fearful and daunting. This obsession with fear came to a head one day while Crane was conducting one of his experiments. He wore his mask and observed one of his test subjects reacting to his fear toxin, as he called it. The unfortunate inmate writhed and screamed, then looked at Crane, seeing the ghastly visage of the mask. The inmate screamed, "Scarecrow," in terror, and his heart gave out then and there. This struck Jonathan a massive mental and emotional blow, all of his childhood fear flooding back. He was reminded of the terror inflicted on him in the cornfield, the anger he felt at his siblings, and the helplessness of it all. It shook him deeply, and it took him days to recover. When he eventually returned to work, he was quiet, subdued, and filled with a new resolve. If he could not cure his fear, he decided then and there that he would be the Scarecrow, the new god of fear, and the terror of Gotham City. He would inflict the fear he felt on others, fiercely and mercilessly, just like the turmoil within himself. The nightmares Gotham had already seen were nothing compared to what Jonathan Crane would bring.
In the year 1857, Pamela Lillian Isley was born in Gotham City. Her parents were of French descent, and a few years before her birth, they moved to America. Pamela's father found employment as a factory worker in Gotham City, and they settled there. When Pamela was 3 years old, her parents were tragically murdered by an unknown assailant. Pamela was too young to fully understand, and even into her later years, she barely remembered her parents. Soon after, the Civil War began, but Pamela was shielded from most of it. Because she had no family in Gotham or elsewhere in America, she was brought to St. Caldwell's orphanage. There she was under the care of Sister Leslie Tompkins. Sister Leslie not only ran the orphanage, but also a prestigious school in Gotham. The orphans under her care received the best education alongside children from wealthier families. Even early on, Pamela's performance in school set her apart as superbly intelligent. She loved learning about science and botany, and Sister Leslie even let her take care of numerous plants in St. Caldwell's garden. Pamela befriended Selina Kyle at the orphanage. She was a bit older than Selina, but she watched out for the younger girl. What Pamela never understood was why Selina would spend so much time with Bruce Wayne. the young heir to the Wayne industrial empire was frequently at St. Caldwell's. He attended the school there due to its reputation and his late parents' friendship with Sister Leslie. Pamela was resentful towards Bruce. She'd never known her parents, and he had everything she didn't: money, influence, and freedom. She continued to learn at Sister Leslie's school, and by the time she was 16, in 1873, she set out on her own. Pamela's stellar performance in school had already proven she was above average intelligence. She soon entered into apprenticeship with Baudelaire's apothecary in Gotham. While it was uncommon for girls to receive apprenticeships in anything other than housewifery, Sister Leslie encouraged Pamela to push for more, and even pulled some strings. She was friends with the apothecary's owner, Jason Woodrue. Pamela learned the trade quite intimately, always attentive and always analyzing Woodrue's work with great interest. She was particularly interested in the herbal and plant-based remedies readily available. By default, she began to learn about agrochemical properties, and it furthered her passion for botany. Woodrue was impressed with the young girl's aptitude for the trade, and he began to teach her everything he knew about all of it: the Thomsonian system, eclectic medicine, and many others. When she was old enough, she enrolled at Gotham University. With the recommendations of both Sister Leslie and Jason Woodrue, Pamela managed to get in. She was particularly interested in learning botany, agrochemistry, and their practical uses in the medical field. One of the concepts she learned of, plant perception, caught her attention. Gustav Fechner, a German experimental psychologist, posited in 1848 that plants were capable of feeling emotions. With attention, care, and verbal encouragement, he theorized that plants would flourish. Pamela fell in love with the concept, though her fellow classmates thought it was utter nonsense. While a doctorate was a difficult license to acquire, Pamela used her intelligence and previous education to achieve it. She graduated in 1880 with her doctorate in botany, becoming the first woman in Gotham to obtain it. Her passion was still with plants. She now began to start her own experiments trying to prove the theories of plant perception. Dr. Isley would often revisit Gotham University's library to read and further her research. In her study of agrochemistry, she met one Jonathan Crane, a young student who was fascinated with the hallucinogenic properties of certain flora. Pamela and Jonathan studied and theorized on many different uses of these plants. While Jonathan was focused on hallucinogens, Pamela took an interest in plants and herbs that had medical application, but could also be deadly. She learned about maythorn extract, which could induce a heart attack in large enough quantities. She learned about laurel bush leaves, which would produce symptoms similar to cyanide. Being a kind soul, she never even dreamed of using that knowledge to harm others, but she learned it nonetheless. This way, she reasoned, she would be able to help anyone who fell ill from such sources. Dr. Isley continued her experiments into plant perception. Jonathan thought it odd, but didn't care. He was focused on research of his own. In 1881, a Dr. Hugo Seltzam came to Gotham, visiting the university. His goal was to obtain research and experimentation methods all over the globe for Wilhelm Wundt, one of the forerunners of psychology in Germany. Seltzam was one of the few in the scientific community who took Pamela and her experiments seriously. He was fascinated by her research into plant perception, and Dr. Isley was grateful that someone was finally taking interest. She shared her theories, notes, and evidence with Hugo Seltzam. Her experiments involved the manipulation and testing of the electric impulses within plants. She was trying to determine if they would behave and act as any animal or human would. Dr. Seltzam took many notes that he brought back to Leipzig, Germany with him. Dr. Pamela Isley continued her research up until 1891, trying and failing to produce the results she desired. She noticed Selina Kyle's return to Gotham, but barely noticed the return of Bruce Wayne. She was engrossed in her experiments. It was her life. Dr. Isley had shared everything with Hugo Seltzam, just as Jason Woodrue had shared everything with her. Little did she know that she would later regret that decision. Little did she know that tragedy was watching her like a hawk, waiting to strike. And she was the prey.
Monsters have been told of in ghost stories and fairy tales for countless years. Vampires, werewolves, and other such creatures have captivated thousands. What most fail to realize is that the common man can be just as much of a monster. Those men can in turn create new monsters made by cruelty. One such unfortunate soul was Waylon Jones. Some speculate that he was born to a mother who was appalled at the sight of him, and others say he was the byproduct of black magic. No one knows for sure when he was born, though it is assumed sometime in the 1870s. Whatever the case, Waylon was born with the rare conditions of ichthyosis vulgaris and atavism. One gave him a scaly appearance and almost red eyes, while the other gave him a tail. Jones looked reptilian in appearance even as an infant. Presumably his mother abandoned him at Haley's circus, where the owner, Taylor Haley, was more than happy to take the boy in. Take him in as a sideshow attraction, that is. Waylon grew up knowing no other life than being jeered at through iron bars by numerous patrons to the circus. He was advertised as the Killer Croc, and was treated like an animal by passers-by as well as the circus owner. People came from far and wide to see the alleged half-crocodile, half-man that Taylor Haley claimed to have. Haley was extremely cruel to the boy, treating him like an animal and feeding him raw meat. He even went as far as to file Waylon's teeth and fingernails into points for dramatic effect. The poor boy had only one friend. She was another person in the sideshow. Mary Louise Dahl, or as she was known at the circus, Baby Doll, was of German heritage. She had been born with proportionate dwarfism, resulting in a very short stature despite her age. She saw in Waylon a kindred spirit, and the boy took a liking to her. She was one of the only people to show him kindness in his cruel existence at the circus. Their friendship helped Waylon to feel human, and was the only thing that kept him sane during his time there. After years of living at the circus, something terrible happened. The police report of an incident that took place in 1882 documents a truly horrendous turn of events at Haley's circus. One patron, while attending the sideshow, was boisterously jeering at Waylon. The man was quite possibly drunk. He began calling the unfortunate boy a variety of horrid and deplorable names. Mary Louise Dahl saw how much Waylon was afraid of the hateful man, and started imploring the man to stop. A crowd began to gather to watch the events, and Waylon watched in horror as the angry man turned his attention to Mary. Waylon's fear turned to anger, even hatred. He grabbed the man through the bars of his cage and violently bit into his neck, killing him. The crowd erupted into a panic, frantically running away. Mary Louise was tragically caught in a stampede of terrified people, and she was trampled underfoot. Waylon was utterly distraught at his friend's death. Knowing he would be blamed and arrested by police, he broke out of his cage and ran. The killer Croc was now truly a killer. The police had little to work with other than the witness accounts of the night, and the two bodies left behind. Based on his previous experiences, Waylon Jones knew that his appearance would terrify people. He fled toward the city nearby, Gotham. On the city's outskirts, he found the Gotham marshes. He found a drainage pipe that led to the city's sewer system, and finally saw a way to live unobserved. He would traverse the sewers into the city proper, and would only come above ground when night had fallen to steal food. For years he managed to live this way quite comfortably. Jones was occasionally sighted, but it was chalked up to mere urban legend. No one believed wild tales of a crocodile man roaming Gotham's streets at night. Waylon successfully avoided confrontation of any sort for a long time, but in 1890 he was surprised by a posse of drunken men on one of his late-night errands. Waylon found himself reliving all the cruelty and hatefulness he had experienced years ago at the circus. The 5 men chased after him and cornered him, throwing objects at Jones. They began to beat on him relentlessly. Unfortunately for them, Waylon's fear again gave way to visceral anger. He lashed out at the men, biting and slashing his way through them. His teeth and veritable claws were still razor sharp.
The inebriated offender stood no chance against Wayland, and he left a trail of corpses and blood in his wake. There were also a few witnesses to these events, people watching from nearby buildings. After years of remaining undetected, Wayland could no longer avoid the public eye. The city's newspapers began to publicize the crocodile man running loose in the city. Artists and journalists alike had a field day with the killer Croc, spinning wild tales and speculations about his alleged existence. Parents told their children that the Croc would come to get them if they didn't behave or go to sleep. Wayland retreated back into the sewers and marshes, now unable to even come out after dark. Both police and thrill-seekers were constantly on the lookout for him now. He could only avoid them for so long. Later in 1890, his makeshift abode was discovered in the marshes, and the police staked it out. They caught Wayland returning late one evening and overwhelmed him with sheer numbers. He was apprehended and, due to his appearance and the nature of his crimes, remanded to Arkham Asylum for the criminally insane. There he was under the so-called care of Professor Hugo Strange. Wayland Jones had already seen enough cruelty and inhumane treatment to last a lifetime. At Arkham, it only continued. Strange was fascinated with Jones's appearance and conditions and conducted numerous experiments on him. During these experiments, Wayland's condition worsened. His skin became even more scaly, and Strange conducted sessions of atavistic regression with Wayland, hypnotically reducing his mind to its baser instincts. Hugo Strange's unethical experimentation continued unabated until mid-1891. Strange would come to regret his treatment of Wayland Jones. Jones may have become a monster, but he was merely the product of many other monsters before him. Taylor Haley, Hugo Strange, and numerous others who spewed hatred at him were responsible. When one is treated like an animal long enough, one tends to believe it. The story of the killer Croc was tragic. Abandonment at his mother's hands, the death of his only friend, and his desire to just be left alone. The crimes he committed were certainly horrendous, but he had been driven to that point, and the odds were stacked against him from the moment of his birth to the moment of his incarceration. But, even locked away in that asylum, Croc waited for his moment to get revenge. The horrors heaped upon him would come back to bite those responsible, quite literally. Just after the American Revolutionary War ended in 1783, the Cobblepot family came to America. They were wealthy Hungarian aristocrats immigrating to the newly forming United States. They gravitated towards a particular settlement, Gotham. They Anglicanized their family name from Cobblepot to Cobblepot in an effort to acclimate to American culture better. They kept their family crest, a penguin, as a reminder of their heritage. Being of nobility, they were proud of their crest and their family motto, "Deep waters are where penguins thrive." They quickly established themselves as figureheads in Gotham's early development, alongside the Wayne and Sionis families. Decades passed, and Gotham developed more and more. The Cobblepots invested their wealth very wisely, helping fund business ventures, construction in the city, and many other prospects. The Cobblepots were very trusting towards their friends. They were very close with the Waynes and cordial with the Sionis family. The Sionises were always envious of the relationship between the Cobblepots and the Waynes. In 1838, Tucker Cobblepot was born. He was a relatively short boy. His height remained this way throughout his life. The Waynes had a child around his age, Thomas, and the two became fast friends over the years. As the two grew into adulthood and the American Civil War loomed ever closer, Thomas fell in love with and married Martha Arkham. Tucker was overjoyed for his friend and was best man at his wedding. Not long after, Tucker met Esther Avery, another young socialite woman. The two began a friendship that blossomed into romance. They were married in 1857, and within the first year learned that they were expecting. They gave birth to Oswald Cobblepot in the summer of 1858.
3 years later, the Civil War hit. Thomas Wayne left to fight, but Tucker Cobblepot was deemed unfit for service due to his physical stature. Tucker was heartbroken to see his friend leave for war, unable to join the fight himself. While Thomas was gone, Martha Wayne gave birth to their son, Bruce. After the Civil War, Thomas returned, grateful to be alive and home with his family. Oswald and Bruce, like their fathers, became fast friends in their social circle. Bruce endearingly called Oswald Oz. The two would make believe that they were going on grand adventures, pirate ships, knights and dragons, and other such things. Oswald treasured Bruce's friendship and Bruce his, but then misfortune struck the Cobblepots. Tucker Cobblepot, ever the investor, heard from Thomas Wayne of an investment opportunity. An umbrella manufacturer was allegedly gaining popularity in Gotham, and Tucker was himself a collector of umbrellas. He was not, unfortunately, a business-adept man. He put a rather large investment into the manufacturer, only to see the business fail miserably within a year. It drove Tucker into a depression to have lost such a large sum. One day, he decided to go on a walk. Esther urged him to take an umbrella as it looked like it would rain, but Tucker couldn't stand the sight of the umbrellas. His failed investment irked him to no end. He went on his walk, and sure enough, it began to rain. Within the following weeks, Tucker Cobblepot contracted severe pneumonia and died. This tragedy struck the Cobblepots to the core. Esther was completely heartbroken, and Oswald was in shock for a long time. The family's remaining finances began to dwindle steadily. The Waynes offered them assistance, but Oswald turned it all down. He had been very close with his father. Oswald's grief had turned to anger at the Wayne family. In his mind, Thomas Wayne was responsible for his family's financial plight as well as his father's death. Thomas had brought the umbrella manufacturer to Tucker's attention. Oswald cut himself off from his friendship with Bruce and looked after his mother. His anger at the Waynes kept him secluded. There was no way he could know that Richard Sionis, the head of Sionis Steel Company, had been truly responsible. Sionis had tipped off Thomas Wayne to the umbrella manufacturer, knowing full well of Tucker Cobblepot's collection. Richard Sionis had set out to ruin the Cobblepots, only to pin it on the Waynes. As a gift to Oswald, his mother gave him his father's favorite umbrella. The rest of the collection, an assortment both whimsical and valuable, was pawned off for petty cash. Tucker's favorite umbrella had been one that had a penguin on the handle. Tucker had liked to use it like a cane from time to time as a joke. Oswald kept that umbrella for the rest of his life as a reminder to himself of what the Cobblepots had been before his father's passing. When the Waynes were murdered a few years later, he felt some satisfaction, much to his own self-loathing. He considered reaching out to Bruce but decided against it. When he reached adulthood in 1878, Oswald set out on his own. He left for Europe, wanting to clear his head and get away from Gotham. There are not many accounts of where he went or what he did while in Europe, but when Oswald came back to Gotham in 1887, he was a changed man. He had somehow regained some wealth that he chalked up to business ventures in Europe. He wanted to bring his business to Gotham, and his business was as an umbrella manufacturer. Oswald again became involved in the socialite circle in Gotham, gaining popularity among them. Some of them remembered him, including Roman Sionis, who had inherited his father's steel company. Oswald also learned that Bruce had left Gotham a year after him. Little did anyone know, Oswald was using his business as a front for weapons manufacturing. It wasn't conventional weaponry by any stretch of the word. Using inspiration from cane swords and other such contrivances, Oswald tinkered with umbrellas and made an assortment of weapons from them. He had bladed umbrellas, umbrellas with guns concealed inside them, and many more. He had become obsessed with them due to his father's former collection and failed investment. Oswald wanted the instrument of the Cobblepot's downfall to be what brought them back from ruin. He would accomplish this, whether by legitimate business or other, more questionable means. There were rumors that he had accumulated his fortune in Europe through robberies and criminal activity, but nothing was ever pinned to him. Along with his obsession with umbrellas came a fascination with birds. He was captivated by ornithology and was a keen bird watcher. Over the next couple of years, Oswald began to establish himself more and more in Gotham. His face became well known by the city council and other business moguls. Oswald propped himself up as a phoenix rising from the ashes of House Cobblepot. He cited his family's motto, stating that Gotham has the deepest waters, and this penguin is thriving. Soon in 1891, Bruce returned to Gotham. Oswald was still resentful towards the young Wayne, but he knew better than to show it. He decided against continuing his distancing behavior towards Bruce, instead seeking him out. The two rekindled some semblance of their old friendship, reminiscing about the good old days. In spite of this, their friendship could never be what it once was. Oswald saw Bruce more as another business opportunity. The next 2 years would be very telling as to the man Oswald Cobblepot truly was. He would do anything and everything to get what he wanted. Everything to restore the House of Cobblepot to its former glory. The Arkham Asylum for the criminally insane opened its doors in Gotham City, New Jersey, during the year 1879. The asylum's founder, Amadeus Arkham, was inspired by the trending construction of mental hospitals in New England throughout the 1870s. He himself was from Danvers, Massachusetts, which had its own asylum opened up just a year prior, in 1878. His brother Jeremiah also moved to Gotham, along with Jeremiah's wife, Helen, and their daughter, Martha. Martha Arkham would eventually go on to marry Thomas Wayne years later. For the building's construction, Amadeus was inspired by the floor plans developed by Thomas Story Kirkbride in the 1840s, known as the Kirkbride Plans. Amadeus was familiar with this style of building from his time in Essex County, which was popular among the hospitals he worked at. Being an orderly who witnessed firsthand the abuse and malpractice against the patients, he became disgruntled and vowed to invest his earnings in his own hospital, one which would treat its patients humanely and with modern medical practices, not crucifixion therapies and exorcisms. Throughout the years, Arkham Asylum has held some of the most infamous and bizarre criminals in Gotham's history within the confines of its stone walls. One of the first patients to be incarcerated at the asylum was Victor Zsasz, a man who went on a mercy-killing spree after experiencing an existential crisis. Victor had a mundane job as a tax collector, collecting debts for the city government. He would go knocking on doors, regretfully informing people of the money they owed. It was a job Victor felt bad for having. He would catch brief glimpses into the lives of those he visited, being able to see over their shoulder a stack of bills piling on a desk, a couple of starving kids, or a sickly wheelchair-bound spouse. These people's lives were broken, and all Victor did was worsen their circumstances. That was his whole job description, squeezing money out of people going through hard times. Ironically, Victor often owed money to others himself, as he had a severe gambling addiction. Supposedly at the lowest point in his life, Victor stumbled across the philosophies of solipsism and nihilism. It's undetermined how exactly he was introduced to these subject matters, but according to his interrogation, once he discovered them, he was never the same again. He felt a veil had been lifted, and he could finally see things clearly for the first time. Everyone else was a zombie, a mindless, philosophical zombie. Empty and hollow, but all the characteristics of a live, functioning human being. Victor, with this newfound personal revelation, went on a killing spree, stabbing the poor unfortunates of society, the homeless, the sick, the starving, the elderly, and the poor. For each one he carved a tally mark into his flesh. After being caught by police, he stated that the killings were all mercy killings, as he was not forcing them to die, but was instead freeing them from being forced to live their meaningless lives. He argued in court that anyone who would force existence upon someone is worse than a murderer. The lunatic's existential ranting was all the judge and jury needed to hear to know a padded room and lithium injections were in his immediate future. In 1886, Arkham became home to Garfield Linz, a pyrophilic arsonist who was responsible for starting several forest fires. But more notoriously, he also lured local prostitutes and set them on fire while they were chained to a bed. Neighbors suspected him to be responsible for the fires when they noticed he always reeked of smoke and ash and had several burn marks on his hands and fingers. It would later be revealed that these marks were self-inflicted, as Linz was so fascinated by fire that he would burn himself for pleasure. In police custody, Garfield confessed to having burned down several buildings that were previously ruled as being accidental gas lamp mishaps. He also described in great detail the arousal he felt from inhaling the smoke and watching the bright embers dance around him like fireflies. It supposedly started in his childhood, when he would entertain himself by lighting a lantern, blowing it out, and then relighting it. He claimed his crimes were his attempts at replicating the excitement he felt. Another one of Arkham's earlier inmates was a woman named Margaret Sorrow, former leader of the Thieving Magpies, a shoplifting ring made up of primarily women. Margaret would instruct the women to pickpocket and steal valuable items to bring back to her. The deal was that anything shiny belonged to her, while anything else the women managed to steal, like paper currency, would be split between themselves. Margaret squatted in a decrepit house, always wearing the same worn, raggedy dress, and with feathers and dust scattered all over the place. Her house was referred to as the Nest by those working under her. In exchange for the shinies, Margaret would provide the women a network of others to help aid them, as well as personally teach them thieving skills, tips, and tricks. Margaret had been a thief since her youth, meaning she had plenty of experience to share. As the years went by, Margaret's demands became more bizarre and neurotic. She went from requesting they steal valuable things like silver and jewelry, to stealing useless junk like spoons and pots and pans. On one occasion, she asked the women to go to a department store, and instead of stealing one of the valuable handbags, to steal the glass case it came in. Margaret complained the handbag wouldn't be shiny enough to her liking, while the glass case would be. Because of this, the gang eventually disbanded and turned her over to the police, who found her in a catatonic stupor, clutching several of her shinies, with a hoard of several other metallic items scattered and piling up all around the house. Christmas tinsel, silverware, keys, tin cans, and other such items. She was escorted out of the rickety house, diagnosed with photomania as well as compulsive hoarding, and sent to Arkham Asylum, where she would spend the rest of her days. The Thieving Magpies would later take the name Gotham City Sirens under new leadership. The Civil War had ended in 1865, but its impact had still been left on the minds of soldiers, some more so than others. In particularly, cavalryman Mortimer Drake and Union soldier Philip Reardon were both incarcerated in 1879. Drake joined the Union in 1863 at age 21. He was inspired by the campaigns of George Armstrong Custer, whom Drake modeled his own eccentric, flamboyant personality off of. This was both his most charming and most ostracizing feature, as it put off many of the other cavalrymen from him. Many accused him of being a homosexual and making advances on others, pushing for his discharge. However, none of these accusations were ever proven. Drake remained as part of the crew for the near remaining 2 years of the war, having a strange mental break near the end. In his spare time at the camp, Drake would read adventure and swashbuckling novels, often trying to recreate the dynamic poses depicted in the writings. His favorite book was The Three Musketeers by Alexandre Dumas. He practiced lunging with his sword, shouting "en garde" at others. He also began altering his speech to sound more formal. One day he challenged a taunting soldier to a sword duel. The taunter, not realizing the seriousness of Drake's request, took him up on it. Drake lethally stabbed the man by jabbing his sword into his chest, and then when others tried to overpower him, he began fighting them as well. The cavalry general came to investigate the camp and found Mortimer dancing with his sword in hand, and a circle of bodies around him. He was arrested and sent to Blackgate, where he would stay until being transferred to Arkham Asylum upon its completion. Reardon's story was a similar one. Reardon was becoming paranoid that others were plotting to stab him in the back from behind, where he wouldn't be able to see them coming. So in Reardon's mind, the only rational thing to do was kill them before they could kill him. He shot them all in their sleep and then ran out of the camp and into the woods, where he hid for days until some Union soldiers found him. He was starved and dehydrated, foaming at the mouth and babbling about how he could see everything. After being sent to Blackgate and then transferred to Arkham along with Drake, his vision started to deteriorate. This caught the attention of Dr. Hugo Strange, who was looking for a patient with poor eyesight to use for experimentation purposes. The specifics of these experiments were never revealed until historians unearthed the notes and journal entries of Hugo Strange several years later. Warning, the following material may be disturbing to some viewers. In 1888, Strange started projects to enhance the several years later. Warning, the following material may be disturbing to some viewers. In 1888, Strange started projects to enhance the senses of human beings. He planned to cover all 5, but never fully got through with the first experiments dealing with sight. He started on a smaller scale, initially planning to develop an experimental treatment to cure color blindness. For this, he used a psych patient named Paul Decker, a crackpot artist who suffered from Stendhal syndrome, a disorder which inspired him to start stealing art pieces and destroying them. Decker seemed to make progress mentally while undergoing therapy with Dr. Arkham, but was also progressively becoming colorblind, which was making him depressed. Strange offered to give him early release from the hospital in exchange for allowing himself to be tested on. Decker agreed, and so the experiments began. According to notes, the experiments involved inserting colored lenses into the end of a cylindrical device and beaming a laser from the other end into the patient's eyes, essentially converting what would be colorblind glass lenses in modern day into a laser beam, zapped into the eyes of the subject. Decker was released to a halfway house and asked to document his symptoms and progress in journal entries. Decker's results initially seemed promising, however, over time, he started complaining about the saturation of everything being too bright and disorienting. Even when closing his eyelids, he said he couldn't stop seeing bright colors. Then he started going on psychotic ramblings about being able to see colors that didn't exist within this universe. Things came to a head when he brutally murdered an orderly who came to check up on him and knitted a crazy quilt out of his skin, which he wore around his otherwise naked body. After coming upon the gruesome sight, Arkham sent him back to the asylum. Amadeus could not understand how Decker had gone from making so much progress to suddenly becoming a psychotic maniac. Arkham was kept unaware of the specifics of Hugo's experimentation. For Strange's next attempt at vision manipulation, he selected Philip Reardon. But this experiment was much more ambitious, as it dabbled in trying to bridge the gap between the scientific and supernatural. The aim of this experiment was to restore Reardon's vision to his fingertips, allowing him to possess dermo-optical perception and 360-degree vision. It started with blindfolding Reardon and trying to apply Braille to color perception. They would lay out colored pieces of paper on the table for him to feel with his fingertips, and get him to memorize the different feels of the colors. He could recognize the darkness of colors due to the fact they absorb more heat energy and are warmer than light colors. He could also recognize the distance between him and another object from the vibrations, and how his voice echoed around him. Hugo unfortunately failed at transferring optic nerves to the fingers, and canceled the project. However, Reardon remained mentally affected. He began having the delusion that he actually could see through his fingertips, and that his eyes were unnecessary, so he promptly gouged them out. He was treated in the medical unit, where he insisted to doctors that he could still see everything around him. He had developed a new neurological condition known as Anton Babinski syndrome, or prisoner's light show phenomenon. It occurs in people who are either blind or stuck in a dark room, and the brain, to make up for the lack of imagery, projects its own vision of the external world within their mind. Throughout the years, the asylum would continue to be the holding place for several odd and unique characters, coming and going like a revolving door. and also being the location where several morbid and harrowing occurrences took place, such as the shocking murder of Martin Hawkins by Dr. Amadeus Arkham, the riot of 1892, the experiments of Hugo Strange, and the Arkham Protest, a protest by mental health care reform advocates to make the treatments more humane. Unfortunately, in the end, Amadeus's asylum became the living hell that he sought to avoid it from becoming. When a person becomes too involved in the role they must play, it can soon become more than a role. Basil Carlo had trained for years in the theatrical art of melodrama. His talent for capturing the emotions and intensity of the characters he played was unrivaled in Gotham City. Basil became popular in 1884, starring in such works as The String of Pearls and The Ticket of Leave Man at Monarch Theatre. This quickly earned him a reputation for playing murderous and horrific characters, and he reveled in his newfound fame. Basil Carlo became a name locals were eager to see each time a new stage play came to the public's attention. Basil was also born with a rare condition known as Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, which gave him unusually elastic skin and joints. This did not hinder his acting ability as long as he was careful, and his condition would not be diagnosed until 1909. Basil was an avid customer of the Sionis Cosmetics division of the Sionis Industrial Empire. He became even more obsessed with using their products once his ego got the better of him. Carlo became obsessed with his roles, with acting becoming his life. Soon, a new stage play began to be advertised in Gotham. It was custom-tailored by the Monarch Theatre to Carlo's talents. Basil was elated to star in this play, titled The Terror, which would feature aspects of a melodrama and horror in a unique capacity. He was to play the main villain, the clay-faced man. Basil took this role the most seriously, but this time he took it too far. He began to act on and off stage, terrifying his co-stars. He would send them death threats in character, stalk them around the theater, and claim it was for the role when confronted about it. The owners of Monarch Theatre were just waiting for an excuse to be rid of him after these confrontations, but it came more tragically than any of them expected. Unbeknownst to Basil Carlo and numerous other customers, Sionis Cosmetics had been using white phosphorus as an ingredient in their products. This dangerous element used in everyday products caused numerous people to contract a condition known as phossy jaw, which caused horrible disfigurement to the individual affected by it. Basil Carlo was one such unfortunate individual, and his face was twisted and contorted into a horrible arrangement. He was hardly recognizable as the famous actor anymore, and the owners of Monarch Theatre saw the opportunity to gently let Basil go. Basil had enjoyed his fame for 5 years, until a new star came on the scene in Gotham. In 1890, Matthew Hagen, one of Basil's co-stars, began to draw attention. His talent rivaled that of Carlo's, and Basil had begun to grow jealous of him, worried that his career would be stolen from him. In light of the recent tragedy, the theater owners gave the title role in The Terror to Matthew Hagen. Basil's sudden disfigurement and his replacement in the play sent the former actor into a downward spiral. Carlo had reached rock bottom and lost all hope of attaining the fame and leading man status he had hoped for. Angry at everyone but himself, he was filled with rage and hatred towards Hagen, the theater owners, and his plight. He broke into the theater, stole the costume for the clay-faced man, and hid within the theater's storage rooms. He lived there for months as the production of The Terror continued. No one was aware of his presence there, but he intended to make his presence known. At first, Carlo's actions were small and written off as accidents. He would cause a small fire here, a loose hanging prop there. Once, he even caused the curtain to fall prematurely on one of the actors during rehearsal, injuring the actor. His anger increased as his attempts to sabotage the production failed, and Carlo escalated his meddling and became murderous. The first incident was when a stagehand was found hanging from the rafters by a noose. Next, a prop dagger was replaced by a real one, causing Hagen to accidentally stab another actor. These incidents became deadlier and deadlier until the police became more involved. All the while, Basil Carlo watched from hidden places in the theater, relishing the pain he was causing. He thought of it as a way to inflict his pain on those who had so readily turned their backs on him. Police were unsure who could be behind the incidents, and were somewhat skeptical that someone was trying to sabotage the production. They thought it seemed more likely that the death had been a suicide, and that the other incidents had just been accidental. Unsure of how to proceed, the owners of Monarch Theater continued preparation for the terror. Basil Carlo was now fully engrossed in his Clayface persona. Furious that the production was continuing, he began to openly attack the actors and stagehands involved, waiting until they were secluded and then striking. Some were seriously injured, some were killed. The police became involved again, but were unsure how the attacker was gaining access to the building. They continued investigations, but had only eyewitness accounts as evidence. No suspects had been identified, and no murder weapons had been found. It was at this point in 1891 that sightings of the mysterious Batman began. It didn't take long before Monarch Theater gained the attention of the Bat. Performing his own investigation, the Batman witnessed Clayface using hidden passages and storage rooms to traverse the theater grounds. The Batman was not yet in the public eye, and no one was the wiser to his presence in Gotham. The vigilante soon discovered a journal that belonged to Carlo, detailing his activities and criminal intent. Utilizing this, the Batman confronted Clayface. Carlo pulled out a knife, and the two battled all across the theater and even onto the stage, dodging around props. The fight did not end until Clayface fell off of the tower constructed on stage. This account comes from the journals kept by Bruce Wayne during his vigilante career. The fall, while not fatal, incapacitated him long enough for the Batman to tie him up and leave him for the authorities. When the police took him into custody, Clayface's former colleagues identified him as Basil Carlo. The Batman had also left Carlo's journal for them. Basil was incarcerated in Blackgate Prison with numerous other criminals. No one was certain who had defeated Clayface, but many of his former colleagues were horrified to discover that he had been hiding in the very walls of Monarch Theater. This case was one of the first cases solved by the Batman upon his arrival in Gotham, though virtually no one knew of his existence at first. Basil Carlo, consumed by anger at his failure, became lost even deeper in the role of Clayface. He eventually had to be moved to Arkham Asylum for the criminally insane due to his volatile tendencies. The production of The Terror continued, and it was a smash hit amongst the citizens of Gotham. It solidified Matthew Hagen's standing as the new best actor in town, with his performance receiving rave reviews. Clayface, in his own way, would gain popularity years later. His tale of lurking in the theater and stalking his former colleagues spread worldwide, inspiring such works as The Phantom of the Opera by Gaston Leroux, published serially in 1909. Years later, William Henry Pratt would take the stage name Boris Karloff after Basil Carlo's own name. Boris Karloff wanted to solidify himself as a horror actor, and the tragedy of Clayface served as a perfect way to do so. Clayface, consigned to Arkham, stayed there until the riot of 1892, when a large number of inmates would escape. The reign of the Ripper in Gotham would cause much chaos in Gotham, and Clayface would strike again. The man behind the Bat, Bruce Wayne, made a large impact on Gotham City when he first returned in 1891. The Batman first started as a rumor. Many were not sure whether he even really existed. Though the Batman was the one actively in the field fighting crime, he was not alone in his crusade. If not for his extensive network of allies, the Bat's crusade against criminality would have been doomed to fail. Of all his allies, Alfred Thaddeus Crane Pennyworth was his most indispensable partner. Born in 1818, Alfred was raised in the East End of London by his father, Jarvis Pennyworth, and mother, Mary Pennyworth. He had a sister, Margaret, and a brother, Wilfred, both younger than he was. His mother passed away when he was 15, and Jarvis did his best to care for Alfred and his siblings in that difficult time. In spite of this, Jarvis was more strict and regimented than Mary had been, having been a soldier and butler for years. Alfred, while obedient, resented his father for this. Upon reaching 17 years of age in 1835, Alfred left his family to begin a career in acting. Jarvis did not approve of this. After an intense argument, Jarvis took Alfred's brother and sister with him to America, wanting to get away. Jarvis soon took up a position as butler at Wayne Manor in Gotham City, New Jersey. The Waynes were ecstatic to bring someone on as experienced as Jarvis Pennyworth. Alfred, still resentful, continued with his acting career until 1837, when he decided to enlist in the military like his father. Acting was taking him nowhere fast, and he felt the need for discipline in his life, though he would never admit that to his father. In December of 1837, he fought in the rebellions of 1837 to 1838. He traveled with his regiment to Canada and fought in the armed conflicts that took place there, aiding loyalists to the crown. He saw many injustices occur here and lost his heart for what they were doing. After finishing his tour with the British military, he fell into a depression. Alfred also moved to America, wanting a change of scenery and a fresh start. He decided to pursue acting again. Upon moving to Gotham, he reconnected with his father. They rekindled their relationship. It was much more amicable now that Alfred had served in the military as well. Alfred liked to frequent bars and clubs in Gotham that had boxing matches available. It was here, in 1853, that he met Thomas Wayne. Thomas also frequented lower-class bars to see how the citizens of Gotham lived. Neither one made the connection that Alfred's father worked for the Waynes at first. After an even boxing match, the two became acquainted. Thomas and Alfred learned of their mutual connection through Jarvis, and Alfred determined for himself what kind of people the Waynes were. Alfred's only frame of reference beforehand had been his father's accounts of them. He saw Thomas as an admirable man. They remained in contact throughout the next few years. Alfred and his siblings were soon taken by surprise when their father died under mysterious circumstances. The police officially stated that he had died when his stagecoach crashed into a ditch, but were unable to pinpoint the cause of the crash. Alfred was grief-stricken and confused. Wilfred and Margaret had moved back to England, and it would take them some time to arrive to help with funeral arrangements. Thomas and Martha Wayne were a comfort to Alfred during this time, and his friendship with them increased as well. It was also during this difficult time that he met Sister Leslie Tompkins. Leslie Tompkins came to Gotham from Pennsylvania, and was of Quaker descent. She did not agree with everything in the religion and lifestyle of the Quakers, but she agreed with their fight for social reform and abolishment of slavery. Leslie had a heart for helping people, even from a young age. In Pennsylvania, she had worked tirelessly to help those in need, working at a free clinic for the disenfranchised. She soon felt a vocational calling. Leslie joined the convent as a nun. Sister Leslie moved to Gotham City in 1853 and took over the school and orphanage at St. Caldwell's not long after. Sister Leslie had a fiery spirit and drive that helped her to gain the respect of almost anyone she came into contact with. She spent the next 30 years turning St. Caldwell's into one of the best free schools in the state. It was soon after Jarvis Pennyworth's passing that Sister Leslie came across Alfred praying in the chapel at St. Caldwell's. She approached him and consoled him in his grieving, and the two struck up conversation. From that day forward, the two were friends. Sister Leslie's tenacity complemented Alfred's disciplined and artistic personality. Their friendship only grew stronger over the years. In 1962, Thomas Wayne hired Alfred as the new family butler. Alfred was apprehensive at first, but the longer he served the Waynes, the more he found himself fitting into the role of butling. While Thomas tended the wounded in the Civil War, Alfred took care of Martha and their newborn son, Bruce. Alfred enjoyed the job and stayed with the Waynes for years. He was an advocate for Sister Leslie's school, and the Waynes enrolled Bruce there after meeting Sister Leslie themselves. By November of 1871, Alfred had become somewhat disillusioned. He'd originally come to America hoping to further his acting career and wanting to rekindle that dream. He found himself planning to leave the employ of the Waynes within the year. Before that could become a possibility, tragedy struck. With the murder of Thomas and Martha Wayne in early 1872, Alfred had reached a decision point. Either he could turn Bruce over to the state and send him to the orphanage and Sister Leslie, or he could stay and watch out for the boy. What helped him reach that decision was the look on Bruce's face at the police station. Alfred saw himself, also an orphan, in Bruce. Alfred could not leave him to fend for himself. He took on legal guardianship of the boy. He encouraged Bruce to continue his schooling at St. Caldwell's. Alfred hoped that being around Sister Leslie would help the boy to heal. Sister Leslie saw the hurt and anger in Bruce, and personally took great pains to help him process his grief. Bruce grew up grateful for his surrogate father, Alfred, and surrogate mother, Sister Leslie. Years later, in 1879, Bruce left Gotham City abruptly. Alfred knew of his plans, but there was little he could do to stop him. Bruce instructed Alfred to care for the Wayne estate and business in his absence. Alfred worked closely with Lucius Fox to do so. Alfred saw Bruce as a son, and watching him leave was one of the hardest things he had ever experienced. Bruce all but disappeared when he left Gotham. We read in the journals of both Alfred and Bruce about Bruce's journey of training, but also Alfred's worries that Bruce may be dead. The parallels between the two accounts show just how deeply Alfred cared for his ward. Alfred feared that Bruce would never return, but as the years continued, his fear seemed to turn to grim certainty. He believed that Bruce was not coming back. Either he was dead somewhere in Europe, or had chosen to start a new life. Alfred was heartbroken that he had lost yet another Wayne to the cruelty of the world. Just when the butler had given up all hope of seeing Bruce again, the young millionaire returned in 1891. Alfred was overjoyed to see him again, and the two quickly caught up. Bruce recounted tales of training with various masters across the world, some well-known and others not. As Bruce shared his experiences, he also began to share his plan now that he had returned to Gotham. He wanted to put a stop to the crime and corruption running rampant in the city. Alfred encouraged this idea until he learned the method that Bruce planned to use. With the birth of the Batman, Alfred begrudgingly agreed to aid his crusade. Alfred witnessed the Batman work on the Clayface case, and his reluctance slowly began to fade. He felt that Bruce was more than prepared for this calling, having seen him in action. Alfred realized that his own calling might be to help him in any way that he could. The two of them became an unstoppable team, working to systematically resolve the issues in Gotham. Not long after the Bat appeared in Gotham, the reign of the Ripper began. Alfred recounts in his journals feeling dread at the realization that he would have to witness his adoptive son go up against this demon, famously known to be from hell. Alfred may have feared for Bruce, but there was nothing he could do to stop him. The Batman would face Jack the Ripper, and both Alfred and Gotham City would never be the same. Victor Fries was born to a wealthy family in Naples, Italy in 1835. His brothers, William and Henry, were both younger than him. His father, Alphonse Fries, was a well-known nobleman. Victor's mother, Loretta, was a noblewoman of popular standing. From childhood, Victor had shown a fascination with the world, and a desire to understand its workings. He found the theories of alchemy quite interesting, though as he grew older, he realized more and more how outdated the theories were. The scientific field of refrigeration caught Victor's attention next. Victor's father encouraged his curiosity towards the sciences. He considered it a good topic of conversation in their social circles. When Victor was 10 years old, he befriended a young girl, Eleanor Faria. Eleanor, or Nora as Victor would refer to her, had been displaced when her family had died in a fire.
Hers had also been a wealthy family, and Alphonse Fries saw it as good publicity that Victor was her friend. The Fries household became like a second home to her. Victor took an immediate liking to the girl, and the two got along quite well. As the years went on, their friendship grew into a relationship. The two were eventually wed in 1853, and Victor attended the University of Ingolstadt in Germany not long after. Nora and Victor Fries had moved together to Germany, and Victor pursued his dream of becoming a scientist, specifically the field of gases and refrigeration. The theories he developed have been lost to time, though many speculate that he developed early theses for laser cooling and even used some chlorofluorocarbons as a fuel source, decades ahead of other scientists. Victor was a natural to the field. Though Victor's work has been lost to time, strides were made later by scientists such as Lebedev, Nichols, and Hull from 1901 to 1903. Chlorofluorocarbons were later pioneered in the 1920s as a fire suppressant. Victor's time at the University of Ingolstadt paid off, and he graduated with full honors in 1857. He and Nora decided to move to America to pursue the next step in Victor's career together, and, upon immigrating successfully, Victor found a job at Boyle Heating and Refrigeration Company. It was located in Gotham City, New Jersey. Ferris Boyle, the owner of the business, was elated to have Dr. Fries working for him. Boyle tasked Victor with developing new methods of refrigeration. Victor, ever the one to think outside the box, used numerous methodologies that most people in his field had never even heard of. He even modified and patented a containment suit derived from a scuba suit. This helped him conduct experiments without exposing himself to the elements. Modern speculators theorize that he may have utilized many things: psychrophilic bacteria, bacteria able to survive at sub-zero temperatures, the physical properties of cold-blooded animals, and many others. Whatever the case, and however outlandish the theories, Victor helped Ferris Boyle's company earn a name for itself in Gotham City. Boyle coined the term that they were freezing to life his business. All was going well for Victor and Nora, until the discovery that Nora was sick in 1891. Doctors were uncertain what was ailing her, and therefore unable to provide adequate medical care. Victor, desperate at the prospect of losing the woman he loved, set about using his scientific knowledge to devise a cure. This desperation drove to Fries developing technology that was decades ahead of anything else in the scientific community at the time. As Nora's condition worsened, he worked to develop a refrigeration machine to try and slow Nora's condition. Some within the Cryogenic Society of America tentatively refer to Victor Fries as the father of the cryogenic field, though that title is tarnished by the rest of Victor's history. He began to neglect his duties to Boyle Heating and Refrigeration Company, and Ferris Boyle began to notice that Victor was taking advantage of his resources. This led to a terrible confrontation. Accompanied by an enforcer, Ferris Boyle confronted Victor in his laboratory within the company building. With Nora already in the machine that he had developed, Victor panicked upon the confrontation. He became physically defensive, and while wrestling with Boyle's enforcer, fell into his machinery and knocked some tubing loose. He was enveloped in the experimental concoctions within the machinery, and Boyle and his enforcer fled the scene. They left Victor to die in his lab. In spite of all odds, Victor survived. In the chaos, Nora's refrigeration machine had malfunctioned, exposing her to the same chemicals as he had been. For her own safety, Victor could not release her from the pod. Upon trying to leave the lab, he discovered that he had developed severe heat intolerance symptoms, excessive sweating, fatigue, nausea, and vomiting upon exposure to normal temperatures. He also experienced alopecia due to the chemicals his body had been exposed to. This caused his hair to fall out. Utilizing the equipment in his lab, Victor adjusted his containment suit to regulate his body temperature. What leads some modern scientists to think Victor had discovered laser cooling was the development of his freeze gun. Others speculate that he merely used liquid nitrogen or oxygen, but we may never know for sure. Victor fled Boyle Heating and Refrigeration Company and retreated to the warehouses along Gotham's dock front. There, he set up a base of operations and hatched a revenge plan against Boyle. Victor's desperation had given way to manic anger. Reason had nothing to do with his plans, and Victor also wanted to retrieve Nora. Ferris Boyle took advantage of Victor's absence. He began to pass Victor's work off as his own. It was in mid-1891 that Victor enacted his plan. Wearing his containment suit and armed with his freeze gun, he broke into Boyle Heating and Refrigeration Company. He attacked anyone who got in his way, freezing them. One such person was Boyle's enforcer, Warren White. Warren contracted alopecia, frostbite, and hypothermia from Victor's freeze gun. When he was thawed out later at the hospital, his nose and ears required amputation. Warren White's life would never be the same after that. Victor stormed through Boyle's company, wreaking havoc wherever he went in his search for Ferris. What Victor did not realize was that rumors had begun to circulate about a bat creature roaming Gotham. His assault on Boyle's company drew the attention of the Batman. Upon finding Ferris Boyle, Freeze threatened to kill him for sabotaging his work and taking advantage of his research. Victor likely would have killed him, if not for the timely arrival of the Batman. Caught by surprise, Victor attempted to fight the Bat, but his containment suit gave him limited mobility. The Bat was able to tie him up and knock him to the floor. With Victor immobilized, the police arrived to take him into custody. Unsure of how to handle his medical condition, the police turned him over to Professor Hugo Strange, warden of Arkham Asylum. Strange made the case that Victor needed psychological treatment and had a special refrigerated cell constructed for Freeze. Victor was detained there, and his containment suit was kept by the police. In light of the attack, Ferris Boyle's company fell to pieces. Evidence of Boyle's corruption mysteriously came to light, and Ferris was ruined. Nora was eventually brought out of the machine. Her debilitating affliction had ceased upon her exposure to the chemicals, and her condition was less severe than Victor's had been, but she was heartbroken upon hearing of his actions. During her husband's incarceration, Nora studied his research, learning the ins and outs of his work in an effort to help with his rehabilitation. She worked at a clothing company, and as the years passed, she spent a lot of her spare time visiting Victor. Though his research and theories are lost to time, Victor Freeze's accomplishments inspired many others to pursue cryogenics. His work showed the things that were theoretically possible. The Gotham Gazette, ever an organization to create fantastical names, dubbed Victor Mr. Freeze. No one particularly believed Victor when he stated that a man dressed as a bat had foiled his revenge scheme, but the Gazette ate it up. Mr. Freeze was the second special case inmate admitted to Arkham after Basil Carlo, aka Clayface. Arkham was gaining a reputation for housing horrors, and Gotham was becoming notorious for creating them. Freeze, a relatively quiet and cooperative inmate, became even colder and colder within. In a way, Victor Freeze had died in that lab, and Mr. Freeze had frozen to life. When the riot of 1892 happened, Freeze was one of the many inmates to escape. His resolve to find his wife would continue to be his driving motive, but he would also be fueled by a desire for revenge against the mysterious Batman. He would not be dissuaded by the public's disbelief of the Bat's existence. Mr. Freeze would hold Gotham in his icy grip, once again. The Batman's public career was just beginning by 1891, but the Bat had been truly born in 1889. Bruce Wayne wanted to keep his crusade as inconspicuous as he possibly could. His only ally, at first, was Alfred Pennyworth. In spite of this, Alfred knew from his experience in the military that the Bat's crusade could not succeed as a one-man show. In fact, it was probably doomed to fail. And so, Alfred took it upon himself to build a network for the Bat. One afternoon, while running errands, Alfred noticed 3 young boys. 2 of them were on the street begging for money, scraps, anything the citizens of Gotham were willing to give. The 3rd one would sneak up behind an unsuspecting Good Samaritan, pickpocketing anything of worth he could get his hands on. Alfred, seeing an opportunity, confronted the boys. They were Richard Dickie Grayson,
Jason Todd, and Timothy Drake. Richard Grayson was the former son of circus acrobats. They had been a part of Haley's circus until Taylor Haley began to treat his employees inhumanely. The death of Mary Louise Dahl and the manhunts for Waylon Jones caused the Graysons to leave. They had tried to report the mishap to the police, but Taylor Haley had been let off with a warning. This angered Haley greatly, and some speculate that he may have been responsible for the deaths of the Graysons not long after. Dickie Grayson returned home one day from playing with his friends to find his parents murdered in their home. In his terrified stupor, he didn't think to report it to the police. He also didn't trust the police after they hadn't believed his parents in regards to Haley. Distraught, alone, and afraid, Dickie wandered into the streets where he was found by a man calling himself Big Bill Dust. Bill Dust pressed-ganged children and orphans off the street into his gang. He called them a family, but his treatment of them was anything but. Dickie found himself here out of cruel necessity, but he made it his personal duty to stand up for the other orphans. Not long after, Jason and Tim were also pressed into Bill Dust's gang. Jason Todd was born in a poor house to a single mother. He never knew his mother's name as she died during childbirth. Jason was taken in by Sister Leslie at her orphanage, but as he grew, so did his penchant for trouble. Jason was fascinated with adventuring. He would sneak out of the orphanage and steal bits and baubles for fun. Eventually, he ran away from the orphanage, living on the streets. He too soon encountered Bill Dust and joined his gang. Jason, while recognizing it wasn't perfect, took to it more than some. He enjoyed the thrill of pickpocketing, becoming the best pickpocket in the group. Jason relished the challenge, and even the sometimes failure that inevitably led to a chase. He loved outrunning his prospective marks. Jason and Dickie got along well enough, standing up for each other whenever Bill Dust was in a foul mood. They were like brothers, inseparable and unstoppable. Dickie was good at distracting while Jason stole. They made an excellent team. They were also like older brothers to little Timothy Drake. Timothy was a very intelligent child. His wide-eyed appearance was off-putting to some, but he never missed a beat when there were things to be learned. Nobody knew where he had come from, not even little Tim. He was abandoned as an infant and found by Bill Dust. Bill had a soft spot for the boy, but he almost never gave that away. Living on the street proved to be a difficult life for the little boy. His small size and innocent appearance gave him almost no credibility among his peers. The only reason he survived the brutality of it was because of Dickie and Jason. Tim hadn't experienced the love of parents, nor the protection and education of the orphanage, but Jason and Dickie took it on themselves to care for him. Jason taught Tim what little he remembered of reading, tales of knights and dragons. Those tales were what eventually led to Tim picking the last name Drake. Dickie taught Tim street smarts and some acrobatics. The trio of boys became even closer throughout the years. They were all expected to bring in a certain amount of money and valuables to Big Bill Dust each day, but that became easier to obtain when they worked together. Alfred, upon confronting these boys, knew that inevitably some children slipped through the cracks. The orphanage could not realistically help all of them. He also remembered what life had been like for him as a lad. Instead of berating the boys for stealing, he instead offered them his card. Alfred told the boys that if they ever required, or desired, work that was better than what they had already experienced, to come to him. The card held the address for a building in the city belonging to Bruce Wayne. The three boys were wary of the older man. Bill Dust had approached them all similarly at some point. Despite the similarity, they eventually took Alfred up on his offer. The murders beginning to plague the city were remarkably reminiscent of those committed by Jack the Ripper in London. They would never openly admit to their fear, but the three boys were scared. Dickie, Jason, and Tim would be crucial allies to the Batman during the reign of the Ripper in Gotham City. Alfred endearingly called them his Robins due to their quickness and efficiency. While they were never directly in the physical fight, they did have other roles to take on. Alfred would have them carry information and transport packages for him, equipment and gear for the Batman, unbeknownst to them. Dickie would eventually take on the mantle of Nightwing, the eldest son of the Gotham Knights, as they were dubbed by the Gotham Gazette. Jason Todd would also join the crusade as the Red Hood, the most feared by criminals within the Batman's allies. Tim Drake would become the Robin, fighting crime through both conventional and unconventional means. The reign of the Ripper was on the horizon, but the Bat would not be alone in his battle. Before the Batman could take on the likes of Clayface, Mr. Freeze, and Jack the Ripper, Bruce Wayne first had to go on a journey. This journey would transform the young man into an instrument of vengeance. Upon leaving Gotham City in 1879, Bruce first went to Europe. He sought out masters of crafts that he hoped would prove invaluable in his crusade against crime. His quest was an attempt to prevent his tragedy, the loss of his parents, from happening to anyone else. Upon arriving in Europe, he met with Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Doyle pointed him to his associate, Joseph Bell. Bell was a Scottish surgeon and emphasized the importance of observation and deduction in a medical diagnosis. Bruce learned from these two experts that no detail should be left unobserved, no stone unturned in an investigation. He also trained in escapology, or escape artistry. He considered this a necessary skill to have should he ever find himself in a tight spot. He trained with many combat experts as well. One of his most trusted mentors was Theodore Wildcat Grant, a British boxer known for his ferocity in the ring. Grant took to this name and wore a mask crafted to make him look the part. Bruce's travels took him to other parts of the world as well, such as East and West Asia. With each stop, he learned more about psychology, forensic science, and combat, both armed and unarmed. One thing that fascinated him in his travels was the work of Siegfried Marcus and the work of Carl Benz. Carl Benz had developed a gasoline-powered vehicle known as the Benz Patent Motorwagen. Bruce witnessed the news that Benz's wife, Bertha, had taken the vehicle on a trip from Mannheim to Pforzheim and back. This impressed upon Bruce the possibilities such a vehicle presented. He had also studied the work of Siegfried Marcus and his own respective gasoline-powered vehicle. Marcus's vehicle was much more practical in design and aesthetic, and Bruce began to formulate his own designs based on the work of both engineers. He wanted to create his own motor-powered carriage for quick and easy transport. Bruce's final stop in his training was with Sigmund Freud, who taught him psychology. Though Bruce learned valuable information, he disagreed with Freud on numerous counts, even proposing his own theories once he had learned enough. Freud was insulted by his students' questioning and cut off their training early, though Bruce had planned to leave not long after regardless. Bruce Wayne's journal recounts his time with Freud as informative yet stagnant. Bruce considered Freud a stubborn and abrasive mentor. Bruce returned to Gotham in 1891, his heart set on returning to his homeland. He was met by Alfred Pennyworth, who was overjoyed to see his ward. Bruce knew that Alfred had worried about him, but he was also happy to see the man who had taken on a fatherly role in his life. The young Wayne wasted no time after getting settled. He formulated a plan of action. Having encountered numerous cultures, Bruce was fascinated with the symbolism of the bat. In the West, they were symbols of fear, vampires and harbingers of death. In the East and Asia Pacific, they were symbols of luck and prosperity. He knew that criminals and people in general were superstitious. The tales he'd heard of spring-heeled Jack, pig-headed women, and other such yarns had shown him this. He crafted a suit using a bulletproof vest, a mask similar to Theodore Grant's, and other tools and instruments. The result was something that he was sure would strike terror into the hearts of criminals in Gotham. Donning this suit,
Bruce became something otherworldly, something terrifying. He became the Batman. He attempted to construct his own gasoline-powered vehicle, but he could not complete it entirely. He would revisit that project consistently. He set out with his war on crime almost immediately. He took on Basil Carlo, the disgruntled stage actor, and Mr. Freeze, the tragic scientist who had been wronged by his employer. Apart from these cases, however, the Batman wanted to find out who had been behind his parents' murder. Now an adult, Bruce could see just how much more Gotham had sunk into its own filth. Street gangs ran rampant, and pickpocket rings operated unopposed. Worse than that, corrupt city officials made money off of the plight of Gotham's citizens. The Bat set to work identifying who would have had the most to gain from his parents' murder. He wanted to believe, even above reason, that there had been some plot devised. He found himself continually frustrated by the lack of evidence to support this belief. The Batman kept his ear to the ground, and eventually he began to hear whispers of a man. This man was sometimes found at a local bar, bragging about his past career as a highway robber. Going to the bar, the unlucky Dak, the Bat confronted the man in an alleyway. His name was Joseph Chilton. Chilton was terrified to be confronted by such a fearsome creature. The Batman had been considered nothing but a rumor by most. Despite his involvement in the apprehension of Clayface and Mr. Freeze, no one had seen the Batman other than the two criminals. Upon interrogation, Bruce discovered that this man had merely been trying to make money for liquor. He had killed the Waynes out of desperation. Rage filled the Batman, and he pulled off his cowl, revealing his identity to the terrified man. This could have nearly ended the Batman's career before it had even gained traction, but Bruce didn't care. Regardless, Chilton, overcome with fear and confusion, tripped backwards over a railing, falling to his death on the streets below the alleyway. This shocked Bruce. He thought he would feel gratified at the death of his parents' murderer, but he just felt remorse and anguish. He left the scene and returned to his loft in the city. Having resolved his parents' murder, Bruce was ready to hang up the cape and cowl. Alfred was relieved to see this. He had just gotten his adoptive son back and did not wish to lose him again. Despite this brief respite, the murders in Gotham began. At first they went unnoticed. A prostitute here, a woman walking home alone there. Bruce didn't notice it until his childhood friend Selina brought it to his attention. Eventually, the murders continued to the point that even the police couldn't ignore it. Bruce donned the mask again, investigating the murders. Then, the first letter arrived, signed Jack the Ripper. The following weeks and months would be as if hell itself had been raised. The Batman would have to face the ugliness within himself in order to stop the horrors that the reign of the Ripper would unleash upon Gotham. The city would watch on in terror, and the Batman would never be the same. Returning by ship in late 1891, Bruce was eager to see Gotham once again. The voyage went well enough, even better when he discovered that his father's old friend, Jacob Packer, was also on the voyage. They got reacquainted, and Bruce learned that Jacob had been traveling abroad for years, taking in the sights and experiences Europe had to offer. Bruce filled him in on his own exploits, leaving out his desire to fight crime upon arriving in Gotham. Jacob was a bit more crude in humor than Bruce had remembered, but he still enjoyed the older man's company nonetheless. It made the voyage more bearable. Upon arriving in Gotham, they bade each other farewell, planning to meet again as they parted ways. Gotham was in no way expecting the horrors that were soon to arrive. Fishermen on the Gotham dock front went about their business as usual. Citizens walked the streets. One such citizen was Dr. Pamela Lillian Isley.
Late one night, she was walking home from her laboratory in the city. Her experimentation on plant perception had hit a dead end, and she was exhausted. As she walked, she most likely must have heard a second pair of footsteps. Looking behind her, she saw the dark figure of a man walking a distance back. Gotham was prone to tales of crocodile men, and it had seen Clayface and Mr. Freeze, so Dr. Isley was surely terrified to be followed by this figure. The dread she felt must have caused her to break into a run, with the figure giving chase. Streets away, a wealthy elderly couple had just been saved from a mugging by the Batman. As the couple fled home, the Batman heard a woman scream, the shrill, guttural scream of someone being murdered. Rushing to the scene, he found Dr. Isley severely wounded with slashes and stab wounds all over her body. She was just barely clinging to life, and so the Batman helped her with what first aid experience he had. As the police began to respond to the sound as well, he left. This attack was the first that achieved the notice of the public eye. Dr. Isley was a staple of Gotham's scientific community. Still alive, but in critical condition, she was taken into the care of Professor Hugo Strange, warden of Arkham Asylum and chief medical authority in Gotham. Bruce knew of Hugo. The doctor had approached him soon after his arrival in Gotham wanting to meet. Bruce had refused, having an odd feeling about the man. In spite of this terrifying attack, the city went on with business as usual. Mayor Tolliver was pushing heavily for the organization of the Gotham World Fair, an event that he was sure would put Gotham City on the map for tourists and future residents. This attack, and the others that soon came to light, threatened to tarnish the clean presentation of the fair, and so Tolliver ordered the police to keep it quiet. This upset Selina Kyle greatly, as she had learned about the attacks from her friend Barbara Gordon. On record, during a city council meeting, Selina spoke out against the attacks and murders, claiming that the only reason the police hadn't already caught the perpetrator was because most of them were women of poor social status. Most of the men on the council wrote off her claims as poppycock, but Sister Leslie and James Gordon defended her stance, further backed by the recently returned Bruce Wayne. Bruce was in attendance that day, along with Jacob Packer. The two had been spending the day together in order to catch up. After the city council meeting, the five met and Gordon revealed the suspect in these recent attacks, Jack the Ripper. Since his colleagues and the mayor were uninterested in getting to the bottom of the case, Gordon saw no reason not to show them the letters that Jack had sent the Gotham City police. It was doubtless the same Jack the Ripper as the one that had appeared in Whitechapel from 1888 to 1891. The murders in Whitechapel had also gone unnoticed at first, as most of the victims were also of poor social status. During this killing spree, 11 women were killed, though only 5 of them were definitively linked to Jack the Ripper. Authorities were unable to find a true suspect, and as 1891 arrived, the murders stopped altogether. No one was sure as to why. During this time, numerous letters had been sent to the police in England, signed Jack the Ripper. The most notorious letter was the one that he signed as being from hell. Selina was outraged to hear this news from Gordon, and he pledged that he would do everything in his power to silently continue his investigation. Bruce expressed his worry to them all and promised to aid in whatever way he could as well. This did little to comfort Selina, and she decided to take matters into her own hands. Going out late at night, Selina planned to catch this murderer herself. Unbeknownst to her, the Batman planned to keep a close eye on her in case trouble should arise. Sure enough, the Ripper revealed himself and attempted to attack her. What he did not expect was for Selina to strike with a bullwhip. She managed to fend him off well enough, but the Ripper eventually began to get the upper hand. That was when the Batman intervened. The Batman joined the fray, and together, the two of them fought the Ripper. Seeing he was outnumbered, Jack the Ripper fled. Selina was furious with the Bat for meddling, and they parted ways. Later that evening, James Gordon was in his home stewing over the murders that had been happening. He was disturbed by a noise outside his home and went to investigate. He discovered the Batman outside. Pulling his revolver on the vigilante, he listened to what the Bat had to say. The Batman claimed to also want Jack the Ripper brought to justice. Gordon, still wary, agreed to work with him. Something about the Batman triggered an uneasy trust within Gordon. The two would become close allies in the coming weeks. The following day, Bruce Wayne and his childhood friend Harvey Dent went out around town. Harvey was now the county prosecutor. Bruce wanted to visit Selina and talk again, so the two men went to the Monarch Theater where Selina would be performing that evening. After viewing a lively performance of dance and song, Harvey and Bruce went to meet Selina backstage. Joining them on their night on the town, Selina, Bruce, and Harvey wound up at the Dionysus Club, a men-only establishment. Bruce owned it, so it didn't take much to convince the doorman to let Selina in with a top hat to cover her hair. By doing that and having her wear an overcoat, no one inside gave her a second look as she sat at the bar facing the wall. Bruce was grateful for the chance to reconnect with her. As the two talked, they ended up on the topic of Sister Leslie Tompkins and the positive influence she had had on both their lives. Suddenly, it clicked in Bruce's mind. Sister Leslie would be a potential target due to her ministry to the poor and disenfranchised, Jack the Ripper's preferred victims. Bruce hurriedly excused himself from Selina's company and rushed to his carriage. Unassuming and peaceful, Sister Leslie was walking the grounds of St. Caldwell's that evening, locking the gates and doors to make sure all was secure. As she did the rounds, she was unaware of the dark figure approaching her from behind. Sister Leslie walked to the church cemetery, as she often did when all was quiet in the evening. It was here that the Ripper cornered her. Sister Leslie was staunch and unafraid at the prospect of death. She had made her peace long ago. Bruce was just arriving to St. Caldwell's when he heard a scream from the cemetery. Still in his plain clothes, he vaulted the gate and ran to the location of the sound. There he found Sister Leslie's body, her habit stained with her blood. Bruce fell to his knees before the woman who had taken on a motherly role in his life after the death of his parents. He found himself taken back to the night long ago when his parents had been murdered, and he was reminded of the recent death of their killer, Joseph Chilton. He was also reminded of his vow. Now filled with a new resolution, Bruce would give in to vengeance. He would find Jack the Ripper and bring him to justice. Bruce was unaware, however, that he had been seen on the grounds at St. Caldwell's. One of the elderly women who was taking shelter at the church saw Bruce run into the cemetery. This sighting would prove to be damning for the young Wayne later on. As the reign of the Ripper came into full effect, darker days were ahead for Gotham City. The Batman would do everything in his power to bring this killer to justice, but it would prove to be a crucible for him. In order to stop this threat, the Bat would have to reveal himself more than he ever had before, and he would have to trust in his allies. Friendships would be tried, and enemies would be made in the days to come. On the horizon was a battle for the very soul of Gotham, one that would see it run rampant with criminals and heroes alike. The death of Sister Leslie Tompkins had shaken Gotham deeply. Those who knew her, which was many people, had seen her as a champion for the poor and disenfranchised, a beacon of hope in a dark city. At her funeral, a great many people were in attendance, though the burial was smaller in numbers. There, Bruce grieved deeply with Alfred and Jacob Packer by his side. After the burial rites were completed, Bruce was approached by a man. It was Professor Hugo Strange, a man Bruce had been approached by previously since his return to Gotham. Strange claimed that he believed Jack the Ripper to be in attendance at the burial, and also claimed to have more information on the murderer. Strange claimed to know this due to a psychological profile he'd been compiling. He instructed Bruce to tell the Batman to come to his office at the asylum around midnight. Bruce was taken aback by this, as he didn't know how Strange knew to ask him. Before he could ask, Professor Strange left the scene. As Bruce approached his carriage to leave the cemetery, he was confronted by an elderly woman. It was the same woman who had seen him on the grounds of St. Caldwell's the night of Sister Leslie's murder. She claimed to him that he had murdered Sister Leslie, and that she would expose him if he didn't pay her off. Bruce refused, leaving in a huff. The woman yelled after him, claiming he would pay. The police present at the burial asked her why she was shouting, and she told them. She told them her name was Marlene Mahoney, and she'd seen Bruce Wayne kill Sister Leslie. No one believed her. On the ride home, Jacob Packer asked Bruce what the altercation with the older woman had been about, and Bruce mentioned to him that it was nothing to worry about, merely a misunderstanding. Later that night, midnight came about at Arkham Asylum. Professor Hugo Strange awaited the Batman's arrival, and, when a shadowy figure appeared in his office, mistook him for the vigilante. He soon found out that he was dead wrong. Jack the Ripper, allegedly having heard that Strange had a psychological diagnosis on him, had come to tie off any loose ends. The Ripper donned one of the many masks that lined Professor Strange's office, collected by Strange over the years, and advanced on the terrified psychologist. By the time the Batman did arrive, it was just in time to see the Ripper push Strange into a pit filled with Arkham's inmates. The Batman rushed to save Strange, fending off some of the inmates as they tried to attack, but Strange was severely injured in the scuffle, later losing an eye. The Batman went in pursuit of the Ripper, but the murderer had set loose all of the inmates of the asylum. The Bat lost track of the Ripper, as he had his hands full with apprehending the inmates. In spite of his efforts, many of the inmates would escape into the city, and a riot of criminals ensued. This event would come to be known as the Riot of 1892. The Batman, bleeding from the wounds he'd received in the asylum, stumbled out into the streets just in time to see the police begin to arrive. He fled on foot with the police giving chase. Stripping off his cowl and cloak, he ran from the police and their dogs. He would likely have been arrested, if not for the timely arrival of Selina Kyle in a stagecoach. Seeing his wounds and his uniform, she discovered the truth about the young Wayne. He was the Batman. The two retreated to Selina's apartment in the city. There, their unrequited attraction to each other came to fruition. They spent the night together, though it was marred when the police burst into the room the next morning. Captain Bullock held an arrest warrant for the murder of Marlene Mahoney, the woman who had claimed Bruce Wayne was the murderer. Since Bruce was the only suspect that came to mind, Mayor Tolliver had ordered his arrest. The mayor wished to put this Ripper business to rest, whatever the means. Bruce was almost immediately brought to trial, and some of his supposed friends showed their true colors. Harvey Dent, the county prosecutor, offered wild speculation and faulty evidence in court to condemn Bruce as Jack the Ripper. He pointed out the correlation in Jack's presence in Whitechapel with Bruce's return to Gotham as the murders resumed in America. Bruce could see that Harvey was acting out of spite. He had been envious before of the attention Selina had given Bruce. Bruce watched on grimly as the veritable witch hunt of a trial ensued. The judge, maintaining a level head, decided to inter Bruce at Blackgate Prison until a state trial and jury could be convened. He was sentenced there without bail. Alfred, Jacob Packer, and others watched on from the congregation in horror. Bruce recounts his time at Blackgate in his journals as dismal and corrupt. The guards enjoyed pitting the prisoners against each other, and the leader of the prison gangs, Cyrus Gold, was the largest bully there, literally and figuratively. Bruce endured much taunting by all parties, as they all believed him to be Jack the Ripper. During his stay in Blackgate, Bruce heard of the chaos running rampant in the streets. Numerous inmates from Arkham were still on the loose, wreaking havoc wherever they went. He overheard guards talking about the Gotham police being spread thin. Bruce felt responsible for not having done more before his incarceration, but his hands were tied. He did not think he could stage an escape without giving away his true identity as the Batman, or inadvertently confirming in the minds of others that he was indeed Jack the Ripper. Not long into Bruce's imprisonment, Selina arrived to visit him. She told him she intended to draw the Ripper out again, and that she would tell Gordon his secret if he wouldn't. She was headed to the Gotham World Fairgrounds. Bruce tried to convince her not to, but she left, her mind set on her plan. What Bruce didn't realize was that Selina had a secret of her own, and a persona of her own. Bruce, now desperate to escape the prison, wrote instructions to Alfred, and bribed a guard to deliver it. Alfred, upon receiving the note, enlisted Dickie Grayson, Jason Todd, and Tim Drake to help him. During supper time at Blackgate, Bruce instigated a fight with Cyrus Gold, which soon escalated into a full-on brawl between the prisoners in the mess hall. In the confusion, Bruce knocked a guard unconscious, stealing his uniform and escaping the dismal prison. He ran to meet the street urchins enlisted by Alfred, where his suit and equipment awaited him within large crates. Bruce silently suited up, and the young boys were terrified when the Batman suddenly appeared in their midst. The terror in the orphans abated as they saw the figure before them meant them no harm. Dickie, Jason, and Tim were still afraid, but in a different way than they had been afraid of Big Bill Dust. This fear was one of awe and respect. The three boys were inspired by this encounter, inspired to be more than the hand life had dealt them. The Batman geared up and opened one of the large crates, revealing a motorized bicycle, one of his minimalistic attempts at replicating the work of Carl Benz and Siegfried Marcus. As he raced to the fairgrounds, he knew this would be his reckoning, a battle for the soul of Gotham. As the Batman sped towards the fairgrounds, Selina Kyle was walking through their very gates. She was completely alone, exactly as she wanted it. Selina thought that the best chance to draw the Ripper out was to provide him with the exact situation within which most of his murders occurred. As she walked alone through the dimly lit area, she was startled when a man stepped forth from the shadows. James Gordon. Gordon told her that he'd heard reports of suspicious activity in the area and gone to investigate. Selina reluctantly accepted his company as she filled him in on her plan. Gordon offered to help, also seeing the potential for a chance to catch the Ripper. Before any action could be taken, another man leapt from the shadows, bashing Gordon over the head with a pipe. Selina recognized this as the same man from her previous encounter with the Ripper. Drawing her bullwhip again, she began running, intending to lead the murderer on a chase. As she did, she shed her civilian clothing for the disguise underneath and donned a cowl she had made. This allowed her to move more freely. The Ripper, just as she intended, gave chase. He carried a razor-sharp knife, intent on catching his prey. In this game of cat and mouse, he had no idea that he was not the cat. After racing to his destination on his motorized bicycle, the Batman soon arrived at the Gotham World Fairgrounds. He stumbled across an unconscious James Gordon, stopping to check that he was all right. Aside from a bruise to his head, the police inspector was unscathed. The masked vigilante continued on, seeking both Selina and Jack the Ripper. Across the fairgrounds, the Ripper reached the waterfront within the locale. Selina Kyle had disappeared, and he was caught unawares by a bullwhip wrapping around his neck. What greeted the Ripper's eyes was a woman dressed in a burlesque-style outfit. She wore a mask that resembled the head of a cat. This was the first appearance of the Catwoman, and she was ready to bare her claws to take down this threat to Gotham. Jack the Ripper was caught by surprise, but utilizing his knife, cut his way out of the whip's hold. The two fought for a matter of minutes, with the Catwoman holding her own. At some point in the fight, the Ripper gained the upper hand, putting her in a headlock. He swiftly injected her with a general anesthetic.
Breaking free of his grasp, they continued to fight, but the Catwoman's senses began to dull until she could no longer remain on her feet. The Batman reached the waterfront just in time to see the Ripper and the unconscious Catwoman in a cable car, working its way up the pulleys. The Ripper, unaware of the Bat's presence, prepared to begin his vile work on the Catwoman. Before he could, he was interrupted by the crash of glass as the Batman came barreling through the car's window. The Ripper, wielding 2 of his knives, attacked the Batman, and the vigilante countered with 2 of his batarangs. They fought like this in close quarters until the Ripper lunged at the Bat, missing him and striking the controls instead. The sparks caused the upholstery within the car to catch fire. The Batman roundhouse kicked the Ripper, sending him out the window of the car and crashing to the Ferris wheel across from where they were. Grabbing the Catwoman, whom the Batman could only assume was Selina Kyle, he carried her out the window to an adjacent cable car. As he did, the burning cable car fell and also crashed into the Ferris wheel. The Bat made sure Selina was secure and chased after the Ripper to the Ferris wheel. With the giant wheel burning around them, the Batman and the Ripper fought like 2 men possessed. They were evenly matched, and their fight went on for several minutes. Then the Batman made a misstep, and the Ripper knocked him down. Poised to strike, Jack the Ripper suddenly staggered back as a knife, one of his own, sprouted from his shoulder. The Catwoman, now conscious, had thrown it from her cable car. The Bat took advantage of the situation, sweeping the Ripper's legs and swiftly handcuffing him to a rail. This action caused the Ripper's hat to be knocked from his head, revealing his face. The Batman stepped forward but stopped abruptly upon seeing the Ripper's true identity. It was none other than Jacob Packer, his father's close friend, and a man who had been like an uncle to Bruce. Packer looked up at the Batman sneeringly, admitting that he knew the Bat was Bruce. He claimed to have pieced it together based on Bruce's intentions aligning so closely with the Batman's actions. When the Batman asked him why he'd murdered so many, he told Bruce of his unreciprocated love for Bruce's mother, Martha. He claimed he had loved her from afar, even after she married Thomas. He'd even told her of his supposed love for her, to which Martha responded with laughter. She had assumed he had been joking. Jacob told Bruce that this had haunted him and caused him to snap. He hired a man named Joseph Chilton, promising him money for liquor if he would assassinate Thomas Wayne. This went horribly wrong and resulted in the deaths of both Thomas and Martha Wayne. Packer soon left for Europe to get away, moving to Whitechapel. Despite this, he said he had heard that laughter everywhere he went, in the faces of women of the night and women passing him on the street. He had killed in Whitechapel and reveled in it. He had then decided to return to Gotham in 1891, where he had encountered Bruce for the first time. Upon reaching Gotham, he continued his spree, unable to stop, as he was unable to stop the laughter of Martha Wayne echoing in his head. During this entire explanation, the Batman listened in horrified silence. This was the first and biggest betrayal he had encountered thus far in his life. This man, who he had admired, loved, and looked up to, was responsible for the deaths of his parents and countless others. He was in a crucible, finding himself in a position to take revenge. Jacob Packer even goaded him to do it, claiming he would see Bruce in hell. After a tense moment of indecision, the Batman moved forward to apprehend Packer and turn him over to the police. Before he could do this, however, Packer stood to his feet. Holding eye contact with Bruce, he slowly backed his way along the railing into the flames building around them. The Bat listened to the screams as Jacob Packer burned alive, and the reign of the Ripper came to an end. The aftermath of the reign of the Ripper left Gotham in tatters. Some would look at the fiery destruction of the Gotham World Fairgrounds as a dark omen. Others would see it as a cleansing fire, one that burned away the false face Gotham had been putting on. The Batman worked in cooperation with Inspector Gordon to piece together what had transpired for the police.
This would spark an alliance between the Gotham police and the Batman for years to come. In the wake of this destruction, the Gotham World Fair would still transpire under Mayor Tolliver's guidance. They would rebuild and celebrate. Seeing his crusade as truly ended, and reeling from the betrayal he had experienced, Bruce hung up the cape and the cowl for months after. He would enter into a relationship with Julie Madison, another philanthropic socialite in Gotham City. The Catwoman would start to make more of a name for herself, taking on leadership of the Magpie Gang and renaming it to the Gotham City Sirens. Gotham would see relative peace for a time, until a new threat would arise. With the Gotham World Fair, and the revelation that the Batman truly did exist, would come many more threats. Many would speculate for years whether the Batman was the cause for these colorful criminals, and whether his influence on Gotham was a good one. Despite this, the citizens of Gotham could rest easy, knowing that Jack the Ripper had been stopped, and his terror laid to rest.